He scoured the umbral planes, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him. And those that tasted the bite of his sword named him the Doomslayer.
Greetings, people of the internet. In this video, I will be explaining why the Doom series is a legendary masterpiece of the FPS genre, and why it is an exceptional example of amazing gameplay mechanics, and why the resurrection of this series is such a big deal. I'll be breaking down this video into multiple segments to give you, the viewer, a broader context of why I believe my claim, though it may seem sensational at face value, actually holds a great deal of significance to shooters abroad in the gaming industry. The structure of this video will proceed as follows. First, I will give a brief history of the Doom series leading up to Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, id Software and its impact on the FPS genre, the original founders of id Software, the slow decline of id Software and the arena shooters of the past, and speak of the change and rise of the FPS genre as we know of it today. Then I will follow up with an analysis and critique of Doom 2016, as well as an analysis and critique of Doom Eternal. Then I will follow that up with looking at how Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal compare and contrast to each other. At the end of the video, I will speak about how does Doom itself set itself apart from FPS games and why is it unique, why the resurrection of the Doom series matters, and what could Doom's success and popularity mean for the shooter genre, and how it could impact the gaming industry, raise the bar, and perhaps push the genre forward, and then end with final thoughts and a closing statement. I hope I can bring some new insight to the gamer demographic concerning Doom and the FPS genre, perhaps even spark conversation on how to help push the shooter genre forward at large. So without further delay, let us get knee deep in the dead. Going all the way back to the year 1991, we have the creation of id Software. While id Software has had many important people over the years that have contributed to its legacy, arguably the most influential people early on were John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall, Kevin Cloud, and Adrian Carmack. id Software had other popular titles like Commander King, Quake, and Wolfenstein, but the game that had put id Software in the spotlight was of course Doom, which released back in December of 1993. To put things into context, while Doom was not technically the first FPS game, nor was it the first game to use the first-person perspective, it set the world of PC gaming on fire, and was what popularized the FPS genre. According to a We Are Developers talk by John Romero, he had stated that the term FPS did not even exist at the time of Doom's release. Doom may look primitive compared to today, but at the time of its release, it was a graphical and technological marvel compared to what else was out there in the market. Doom was truly nothing like anything else in the gaming industry. Simply put, you were one man with a huge arsenal fighting the legions of hell. With a heavy metal inspired soundtrack, the dark and foreboding atmosphere, as well as use of demonic iconography. The game was also moving at a breakneck speed. It was the most intense game of its generation. Following the release of Doom 1 and 2 and the impact that it had on PC gaming at that time, If you go back, you can easily see the many games that it inspired, as well as how closely that those games had followed the Doom formula in terms of game design. Games such as Quake, which id Software, of course, themselves created, Unreal Tournament, Tribes, Duke Nukem, Painkiller, Serious Sam, just to name a few. In the early years of PC gaming, I would dare say the mainstream FPS game was the Doom-like FPS. And what I mean by that is things like you as one guy, one player fighting a plethora of enemies that all have their unique functions and threats that they pose to the player. The player having this huge arsenal of weapons that all have their own defined strengths and weaknesses, and the player learning how to use those effectively on particular enemies. As well as learning to navigate these big sprawling areas, figuring out where resources are such as ammo, health, armor, secrets, and hidden like super pickups, so on and so forth, as well as the very fast-paced, just the breakneck speed and the intensity and chaos that these FPS games played. Now, of course, each of those games back in the day, those classics, they all have their own particular take and twist on the Doom formula. But at its core, you can clearly see the inspiration that Doom had on those FPS classics. Now, let's not forget that it was Quake that really set the arena shooter multiplayer world ablaze. So early on in PC gaming, we can clearly see that id Software had this legendary impact on the FPS genre. Unfortunately, good things can only last for so long. Just as the influential founders of id began to slowly leave the company over time, so did the landscape of shooters began to take a strange turn. Tom Hall had left id Software around August of 1993. He was the creative director at id Software during his tenure and was the man who created the Doom Bible. From what I've gathered, he intended Doom to be more in the line of the likes of like an old school tabletop, Dungeons and Dragons, pencil and paper, RPG-like narrative. Unfortunately for him, this did not become manifest, and he eventually left id Software because he felt isolated and out of place from his coworkers. He worked on titles like Rise of Triad, Terminal Velocity, as well as Duke Nukem 2 and Duke Nukem 3D. He also worked on the Prey engine and then would eventually set off to co-found Ion Storm with John Romero, who worked on Anachronox and Deus Ex, where it was clear he was able to fully employ his desire to create a more narrative and story-driven based game. John Romero had left around 1996 because, simply put, him and John Carmack did not see eye to eye anymore, nor could they seem to get along, all speculations aside. His main contribution, from what can be gathered, was his influence and impact on the gameplay design of the Doom series and Quake. Of course, he had some work to do in terms of graphics design and level layout, but it was mostly gameplay is where his influence is most felt. He would later on to go and work on the game we know as Daikatana. Even though it was an ambitious game and had some great ideas on paper, in execution it ended up being a buggy mess that was not well received. He has been credited with coining the term deathmatch. Adrian Carmack was one of the two influential artists that had helped design the look of the Doom series. While I wasn't able to gather much information about him, it is clear that he had departed id Software around 2005 to pursue his career as an artist in other fields. John Carmack, who was probably the most influential person concerning computer programming at id Tech, he was the main man who was behind the id Tech engine. He has been credited with inventing and has made major contributions to computer graphics technology, as well as popularizing certain computer graphics techniques. He eventually did leave id Software in November of 2013. This is just my speculation, but John Carmack always just seemed to be a smart, nerdy dude who was just really interested in pursuing new and different technologies. He was quite literally a rocket scientist for Armadillo Aerospace, even when he was still with id Software. So perhaps he lost interest in games and had wished to pursue other technologies like VR. But of course, this is just my speculation. Kevin Cloud is the other influential artist that helped design the look and the feel of the Doom series. He is responsible for a lot of artwork and graphics and design in the other id games as well. He was, and this is according to the no-clip documentary titled Doom Resurrected, was the main man leading the development of Doom 4 that potentially could have ended up being a Battlefield Doom or a Call of Duty Doom. Yet, he was a deciding factor in canceling the development on this Doom 4. He had stated in the documentary that it was a rough time for him at the id Software company, but in the end, it was a hard choice, but it was the right choice. And for that, we should be thankful. id Software and arena shooters as a whole started to enter a downward decline at some point. And when I say this, I mean it in the sense of game design and relevancy. Now, it can be debated on when and where this started to take place, but if I had to wager, I would put my money on the release of Doom 3. Now, Doom 3 was not by any means a bad game. It was actually a fairly entertaining shooter and a computer graphics marvel at the time of its release. However, compared to Doom 1 and 2 and Doom 64, it was not a good Doom game. By this time, John Romero and Tom Hall were long gone. So with John Carmack at the helm being the main influence of the direction of Doom 3, it would end up being, if anything, a technological demonstration of what the new id Tech engine was capable of and how it was pushing computer graphics forward. There is a lot that could be said and critiqued about Doom 3, but the most important thing to take note of was Doom 3 was the writing on the wall, the sign of the times. FPS shooters were beginning to turn to a different approach in game design. We can look back and see what contributed to this change. Games like Halo Combat Evolved, even though releasing in 2001 and being somewhat of an arena shooter itself, made a huge impact on slowing down the pacing and the speed of the combat, and also helped pave the way to popularize FPS games on the console platforms. Other games like Half-Life 2, Fear, Far Cry, Crysis, Gears of War, Call of Duty Modern Warfare completely changed the landscape of the shooter genres. There was more emphasis on making combat more slowed down and methodical, more tactical, and more of a cinematic presentation. FPS games were no longer about breakneck speeds and chaotic combat with a huge arsenal of weapons and legions of foes trying to kill the player. Now, there will always be a few exceptions to this statement, but you get the point I'm trying to make. To add salt upon the wound, the two big heavy hitters in the arena shooter demographic failed to attract new players to their community. Neither were they able to appeal to their existing fan base. Quake 4, which had launched in 2005, was met with lukewarm reception. It was not a bad game, but simply failed to captivate the Quake community, and most players just went back to Quake 3. Unreal Tournament 3 was also not well received by the Unreal Tournament community, and saw a huge drop in player population and diminished outcome of competitive play. It was also clear Epic Games was putting more focus, time, and resources on their new franchise, Gears of War. id Software was still doing okay after Doom 3 and Quake 4, but it was after the release of their new IP, Rage, which made its multi-platform release in October of 2011. Rage had a development cycle of roughly 6 years. By the time Rage had released, so much had changed in the FPS market, Rage was really like a game from another place in space and time. It featured interesting tech like megatextures, but it was simply too burdening on modern systems. It had good animations, and hit reactions from NPCs in combat was impressive, but most of the game simply felt dated, as well as its systems. John Carmack actually made an interesting statement concerning Rage on his interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. He had said that time has a physicality to game development that you can't really comprehend. And with the underwhelming reception the game received, you can see his point. With Doom 4 still being in a weird state and lacking direction or a complete identity of itself, id Software was in a rough situation. However, it would still be more than 5 years till we saw the next entry in the Doom series.
They are Rage.
Brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear, until it is done.
When the player first starts up Doom 2016, they begin inside of the UAC facility, which has a highly advanced, sleek, albeit utilitarian and industrial aesthetic. Shortly thereafter, the player gets to set foot upon the surface of Mars and must traverse the lifeless landscape of the Red Planet. The atmosphere throughout the UAC, the surface of Mars, as well as certain levels where the player is in the Hell Dimension, have a dark, unwelcoming, and foreboding atmosphere. The sense of macabre is strong, as most of what is left of the UAC personnel have all died in horrific manners, and the remains are being used in evil magics to bolster the presence of the demon invasion of Mars. At times, it is almost a horror genre-like presentation. The feeling is even encouraged when the menu theme for Doom 2016 is Hellwalker, a track that reverberates a slowly, ever loudly sound of impending doom, pun intended. Of course, Doom 2016 is not about horror at all, but while gameplay is more akin to Doom 1 and 2, the visuals of the game pays closer homage to Doom 3. Certain enemies like the Hell Knight are almost a one-to-one recreation. Even things such as the Doomslayer's suit, the Doomslayer's weaponry, having relatively grounded utilitarian aesthetics. While Doom 2016 is not a game that takes itself too seriously, the presentation comes off as more of a believable presentation, like that of what Doom 3 was before it. In terms of graphical fidelity, it is really quite impressive, especially when you consider this game runs at 1080p at 60 frames a second on the PS4 and Xbox One platforms. The game is still able to display highly complex geometry, highly detailed textures on the environment, weapons, enemies, and NPCs, as well as high-resolution particle effects. What is really impressive that becomes more utilized in Doom Eternal is the enemy damage and dismemberment enemies suffer. Depending on where the player shoots and with which weapons, enemy models will be damaged and dismembered in fairly gruesome detail. Doom 2016 starts off a bit confined, particularly in the first two missions. But starting with Mission 3, The Foundry, the levels begin to open up and begin to sport a more sprawling environment like that of Doom 1 and 2's design. These levels are open-ended and allow the player to explore the mission in their own way. There are, of course, other levels that have a more direct approach, but none feel too restricting. The player is almost always given enough space to feel like their agency is maintained when searching the levels for resources and hidden secrets. For the most part, traversal simply requires enough speed and properly timed jumps to access all of the available real estate. Occasionally, the player must interact with specific objects to open previously closed paths, but everything ebbs and flows like that of the classic Doom games. I feel the most important thing to take note of in observing the level design of Doom 2016 is map and navigation. The player is expected to consult their map and observe their surroundings to navigate the environment. Map navigation is one of the many pastimes of old school FPS design. The sound of Doom 2016 is engaging and helps immerse the player. But the sound is not designed for the player to focus on narrative or environmental storytelling. It is designed to suck the player into its chaotic combat and breakneck pacing of gameplay. In between fights, the sound is constantly keeping the player in anticipation, keeping you in a state of constant engagement. You are deep within enemy territory and everything you encounter will be hostile. So any noise or any sound is a hostility towards the Doomslayer and must be destroyed. When in combat, imps come off as a young but ambitious spellcaster with crackling fire and ferocity of each of its lacerating swipes, as it throws fireballs towards the player that can always be heard whistling by. The Hell Knight is the mighty and heavy-hitting demon that seems to shake the earth with its every quake and leap. The Cackle Demon makes a noise of ravenous, monstrous appetite, for it must satiate its great maw of teeth. The Mancubus, a gluttonous, disgusting mass of flesh that sounds put off almost a fumigating stench. The Pinky, an angry, stampeding wild boar, constantly trying to gore the player as it squeaks at you wickedly. And finally, the Baron of Hell, a giant demon whom strikes at the player have a devastating crack and even wields green demonic magic that sounds like it is composed of the stuff of nightmares. However, the Slayer is equipped with an equally grisly satisfying sound of weaponry. When the player is in combat, every weapon in their arsenal wields an intimidating shockwave of noise. The chain gun is a rapid lead delivery that can shred your foes with its blistering rate of fire. The super shotgun is like a giant blacksmith's hammer smashing into an equally giant anvil. The rocket launcher is like a portable N1 Abrams tank turret yielding high explosive rounds made to demolish entire buildings. The Gauss cannon cracks out a hypervelocity dose of superheated plasma that will vaporize anything its beam comes into contact with. The chainsaw is a violent flesh grinder that sounds incredibly painful even from far away. And of course, the BFG 9000, a weapon that when fired puts off so much energy and heat and leaves so much devastation in its wake. It warps and distorts the space-time continuum around it. Glory kills are able to express and captivate a grisly satisfying crunch when breaking of bones, rending of flesh, and eviscerating demons at close range. This brief yet intense moment of the gameplay loop is treated with high fidelity in the sound department. And then to add even more carnage, even more rage to the Doomslayer, is the Mick Gordon soundtrack. Mick Gordon is not only able to capture the subtle feel and the atmosphere between fights, as well as the technological hubris of the UAC and the inhospitable nature of the Hell Dimension, but he is able to add another element to the chaos of the intense combat of Doom 2016. The deep vibrating thuds and heavily distorted guitar riffs help express the utter disdain and hatred that the Doomslayer has for the Legions of Hell. However, Mick Gordon does a fantastic job at paying homage and respect to the old Doom tracks while adding his own unique sound as a composer. The track Harbinger is clearly inspired by the Doom 3 menu theme. Hellwalker is a fantastic reimagining of the original Sign of Evil track from Doom 1. Mick Gordon is able to take these old music tracks and bring them into modernity with Doom 2016. Other tracks like Rip and Tear and BFG Division, while not recreations of old Doom tracks, are clearly following the same chaotic rhythms of the classic Doom 1 and 2 games. And you, the viewer, may ask or wonder, why is heavy metal used in the Doom games when clearly very few games, if any, use such a genre in their soundtracks? What is it that makes heavy metal fit so perfectly into the gameplay loop? There are great reasons as to why. Heavy metal is fast, frantic, and chaotic, yet there is a order, a rhythm to the chaos. Heavy metal is about the intensity of emotion, whether that be anger, hate, sorrow, sadness, depression, perhaps even joy. It is technical and requires a specific skill set to execute properly. Heavy metal can be an expression of masculinity, machoism, particularly the crazy stir men can enter when engaged in warfare. This is a perfect reflection of the combat of the classic Doom games, and a perfect expression of the Doomslayer's mind and character. When you're in the moment and you begin to feel that berserker rage, it is a moment of pure bliss. Now you may be wondering why bother trying to talk about story and narrative in a Doom game. Yet I feel like Doom 2016 actually has an interesting take on the setting and the Doomslayer himself. There are also some interesting observations that can be made of the Doomslayer's character. Though the Doomslayer does not speak, a lot can be derived from his behavior. First and foremost is his unbridled hatred for demons and demonkind. He is not compromising in his quest to vanquish evil. When Samuel Hayden asks him to carefully disable the Argent energy filters, the Slayer disregards his request and simply destroys them. It is the use and consumption of Argent energy, Hell energy, that led to this demonic disaster in the first place. When Samuel Hayden tells Vega to give the Slayer what he wants at the end of Mission 2, he is shown how widespread the demonic infestation is and how many human lives have been lost. The spread of the demonic infestation seems logical, but why the human casualties? Perhaps the Slayer cares about the preservation of human life? I believe this point is driven further when the Slayer meets Olivia face to face for the first time, at the end of Mission 3. Olivia Pierce states that you could not save them all, implying that the Doomslayer earnestly wants to save as many human lives as he can. Also, this cinematic is deemed controversial because the Doomslayer simply stands there and watches Olivia, speaks, and walks off. This may seem far-fetched, but perhaps the Slayer gives humans influenced by demonkind a chance to resist their influence or repent before judging them. Another detail to add is that as far as I can look back and remember, the Slayer has never killed any human being. And when I mean human, someone who is not possessed or zombified. Perhaps the Slayer was waiting to see her make the wrong choice before judging her. Or perhaps the Slayer is not capable of killing humans. Or maybe he views them as ignorant, lost, or simply just way in over their head, and that killing them would do so little to stop Hell's plans. We can observe that the Slayer seems somewhat capable of reasoning, or at least hearing about what people have to say. When the Slayer meets Samuel Hayden for the first time, he does not just take what he wants and then leaves. He stays and listens to what Dr. Hayden must say. It would make sense to say that he was doing this because Samuel Hayden is actually providing much needed information, and this is a valid point. However, we notice that the Slayer does not destroy Hayden. Even though he is ultimately responsible for the UAC facility on Mars and Argent energy production, as well as being partly responsible for allowing Olivia Pierce to do her crazy demonic practices. Once again, like I said with Olivia, perhaps he spares Dr. Hayden because the Slayer views him as a fool who got caught up in something he could never comprehend or truly understand the scope of what his hubris would bring. Also, near the end of the game, when the Doomslayer must enter Hell once again to close what is called the Well, he has to cause a meltdown of Vega's systems. The Doomslayer chooses to save Vega before the meltdown takes place. Whether it is out of pragmatism or preservation, it is an interesting note nonetheless. One final point that I feel is most important to take note of concerning the story of Doom 2016 is throughout the Codex entries, either by the researchers of the UAC facility or the Doomslayer Testament writings located in Hell, helps establish the legend of the Slayer. The manner in which the Doomslayer is talked about as if he is a folktale, a legend of ancient history, a mythological figure. A YouTuber by the name of Noah Jarvey, who does great analysis on video games, and I will also leave a link to his channel below in the video description, makes a astute observation in that the Doomslayer is not so much of a person, but that he is like a vessel for the player. He is like a mythological figure of the FPS genre. That participating in Doom is like a ritual. That the Doomslayer will never run out of battles or battlefields. And that in this ritual, the game is asking the player to drink from its altar and partake in a communion. I tend to agree with this assessment, so that carefully observing Doom, it actually has quite an amazing meta-narrative in its relation to the FPS genre and the player themselves. Moving onward to gameplay, which will be the last part of this analysis, but also the most in-depth. Starting off with movement. For most games, something as simple as movement, there really isn't much to talk about. However, in terms of Doom, having good movement is essential to victory. First and foremost, the player needs to be on the move at all times. Enemies are aggressive and can do a lot of damage to the player in a very short window of time. Movement is blistering fast because the player is not contending with normal foes. You are facing off against hell itself. Some enemies are large and sluggish and can be flanked or outmaneuvered. Others are quick and will try to stay on top of the player as much as possible. However, simply staying on the move is not enough. Enemy AI is able to calculate the player's trajectory and will tend to attack the direction in which the player is heading. So often, you have to make erratic changes in direction to avoid taking damage. Also, when you add in jumping or tools in the environment like jump devices or portals, it adds in another layer to the player movement. Jumping seems simple enough, but moving in all three dimensions helps evade enemy attacks instead of moving in just two dimensions. Lastly, movement in position will help the player maximize their effectiveness depending on the weapon of use. Shotguns often have to be in close range to deal maximum damage. Weapons like the Gauss cannon in siege mode can penetrate multiple targets, so you want to try and lure the AI into a line to hit as many as possible. Other weapons like the rocket launcher, while powerful, can harm the player, so you want to be able to affect as many targets with its splash damage, but never be too close to harm yourself. Moving on to weapons. Starting with the pistol is the starting weapon that the player gets at the very beginning of the game. It has its uses early on, but unfortunately becomes completely irrelevant later on in the game. However, early in the campaign, it can be useful when fighting imps, possessed soldiers, or the zombified enemies. And it can be helpful, particularly when you're out of ammo or you simply need to keep your distance. It could also be used to, let's say, take out explosive barrels or even take out a lost soul, but unfortunately its uses become extremely limited later on. The combat shotgun. The standard firing mode is effective at killing weaker demons at close range, but begins to lose its effectiveness on tougher demons fairly quickly. Its charged burst fire mod is somewhat useful, but becomes redundant once the player gets the super shotgun. The explosive shot mod, when fully upgraded, maintains its use even in the endgame, as a direct hit can create a cluster of smaller fragments to deal additional damage. This firing mod becomes even more deadly when used in weapon switching due to its high burst damage. The heavy assault rifle, with its standard firing mode, is good at quickly eliminating weaker demons at range due to its damage output and accuracy. The tactical scope mod is strong when fully upgraded, and landing headshots does grant a noticeable damage increase. However, most players will tend to use the micro missile mod simply because of its ease of use. and its ability to quickly lock onto targets if the player's reticule is aiming within the general vicinity of the target. It is still only effective on weaker demons, and particularly those at range. The Plasma Rifle. The Plasma Rifle's standard firing mode is effective, but only at short to medium ranges. Also, depending on how nimble the target is that the player is aiming at, a lot of the plasma rounds can miss, ending up in feeling underwhelming in the damage department. Most effective, perhaps, when strafing backwards against a pursuing enemy to kind of ensure that most of those shots land and you get the most damage. The Heat Blast mod deals decent damage in a small area of effect, but also a lot of ammunition must be spent to charge up this mod. However, using the Heat Blast itself consumes no ammo and can kill weaker demons instantly. The Stun Bomb mod is the most useful, especially on harder difficulties, because it can get you out of a tight spot and the stun can spread to other demons when fully upgraded. It is an okay weapon, but is really only useful later on with the Stun Bomb on higher difficulties, and eventually is outshined by other weapons. The Super Shotgun. This weapon only has one firing mod, but it only needs one firing mod. When fully upgraded, it can fire 2 rounds before reloading, and has an extremely fast reload speed. It is extremely powerful at close range, and has a lot of stomping power. This gun is considered to be a bit overpowered, and eventually becomes more balanced later on in Doom Eternal. The Rocket Launcher is a powerful high explosive weapon that can destroy weaker demons with indirect splash damage. It is effective against stronger demons, but requires a direct hit. Remote detonation is effective and user-friendly when friendly upgraded, and can be quite powerful in that it can set off a secondary explosion first, and then the missile projectile itself can cause splash damage either on a direct hit on an enemy or on some surface. Lock-on Burst can chew through your ammo quickly, but has an incredible burst damage potential, and becomes even more powerful when used with weapon switching. The Gauss Cannon is a very powerful, very precise weapon that can completely evaporate weaker demons and kill stronger demons quickly when used properly. Precision Bolt mod is powerful, especially with headshots, but most players will end up using Siege mode instead due to its wide beam emits damage output. When fully upgraded, even with the player's limited movement, the charge time is fast enough to be worth that movement penalty, if used in the right moments. It also has a strong pushback when fired, and this can be exploited to help with the player's movement and speed. The Chain Gun is a weapon that has a high rate of fire and chews through ammo fairly quickly, but deals good damage and is good at suppression. The Gatling rotor allows the player to keep the barrel spooled up and will deal extra damage when fully upgraded, while allowing the player to move at full speed. The mobile turret seems to deal more damage, yet slows the player's movement down quite noticeably. It can overheat, but this problem can be eliminated when fully upgraded. Depending on the difficulty you play on, you may want to use the Gatling rotor because it is going to allow the player to maintain their movement speed even while this weapon isn't used. The Chainsaw. The Chainsaw can instantly kill demons at melee range, granted the player has enough fuel. Also, it can help resupply the player with ammunition if needed. It tends to be less effective against strong demons, as it requires more and more fuel to execute them at close range. Frag Grenades, Hologram, and the Siphon Grenade. The Frag Grenade deals decent damage and can clear out a pack of weaker demons or help stagger larger demons if you're in a tight spot. It is useful, but becomes less and less used later on in the game. The Hologram is useful for getting enemies off your tail if you need to recover health, ammo, or armor. Or you can simply, in a tight spot, use it to reposition. The Siphon Grenade is easily the most useful of the three, in that it can damage as well as drain enemies' health as well as with the combination of the equipment power rune, can even drain armor for the player. Extremely powerful later on in the game and at higher difficulties. Last but certainly not least, the BFG 9000. This is the one gun to rule them all. Will completely vaporize anything within its projectile range. The Baron of Hell and Cyber Mancubus are the only two demons that are not bosses that can potentially survive its tendrils if its exposure is not long enough. Ammo is very scarce, so you should only use this when it is absolutely needed. Most effective on bosses when interrupting powerful attacks or stunning them to get in additional damage near the end of the fight. Now, the last and final weapon in the player's arsenal would actually be melee. Now, regular melee attacks, of course, do very little damage, and on higher difficulty, if you were, let's say, trying to pistol whip demons in the face, on a higher difficulty, that would get you killed very quickly. However, the big new feature that Doom 2016 had introduced was the Glory Kill system. Now, the Glory Kill system is a great new feature in that it has multiple functions that the player can exploit. First and foremost being that when the player performs a Glory Kill on an opponent, they will always drop health. Now, this is obviously very useful because if the player is close to dying or wishes to top off, the simple and quickest way to do this is by performing a Glory Kill on a demon instead of trying to search for that resource somewhere on the map. Now, another thing to take note of is that when the player enters a Glory Kill state, and this includes the use of chainsaws, is the player is invulnerable during that animation. Now, the flip side is that you are stationary and cannot move when this happens. So, in particular situations, while demons cannot harm you while you're in this animation, they can close in on your position and potentially surround you. So that by the time you exit the Glory Kill animation, you may potentially take a lot of damage or die. Now, the flip side is that you can use this mechanic carefully to try and avoid damage from certain attacks. One simple example would be, let's say there is a lost soul heading your direction to explode in your face and deal a shit ton of damage. Well, one way to avoid this would be to perform a Glory Kill on a nearby demon, which would make you invulnerable to damage and the lost soul would do nothing to you. Now, Glory Kills actually become more effective later on in the game because the tougher and tougher demons, of course, end up having a larger health pool. And so what happens is that when a demon enters a staggered state, you're able to immediately finish them off right then without expending any more ammo. Now, the flip side of that is if they break out of that stagger, they go back to having a certain portion of health. And especially with the stronger demons, they can still take a lot of ammunition before you can put them down. So you can see something as simple as the Glory Kill system, while it has a great cinematic and action-packed quick time event presentation, it actually does provide new functions that the player can exploit to improve their chances of victory. Moving on to the Praetor suit, runes, and power-ups. Starting with environmental resistance, hazard protection is a useful perk, but mostly on higher difficulties in that it reduces environmental damage, and especially that of explosive barrels. Self-preservation is really most effective for using the rocket launcher. This can be avoided, of course, with proper skill and movement, but it is a nice perk for inexperienced players. Barrels of Fun makes you immune to barrel explosions, which is incredibly useful on higher difficulties in that you don't mistakenly die to a chain reaction. Area scanning technology, item awareness, secret sense, and full view is helpful for new players trying to explore the map and find secrets on their own, but ends up being completely useless on repeated playthroughs. Equipment systems, quick charge, stock up, rapid charge, these are all useful in that they reduce the cooldown of grenades and grant you the use of 2 before having to recharge. fairly useful. Power-up effectiveness. Power Surge emits a powerful blast when a power-up wears off, and this actually does deal quite a bit of damage. Healing Power completely heals you when you pick up a power-up, and this is extremely useful, especially if the player is in a critical situation. Power Extender increases the duration of power-ups when used, and this is easily one of the strongest Praetor suit perks. Dexterity. Adapt allows you to switch weapons faster. Newer players will underestimate the strength of this perk, as it allows you to combine extreme amount of burst damage when combining certain weapons, and this is essential on higher difficulties when dealing with stronger demons. Quick Hands speeds up how fast you grab ledges, which is mostly useful and helps the player maintain speed in combat. Hot Swap allows you to switch weapon mods faster, however most players will stick to one weapon mod. The rocket launcher is really the main weapon I can think of where both mods are actually useful throughout the entire game. Moving on to runes, Vacuum allows you to pick up items from a much further distance, which is a nice convenience factor, but actually has some uses in boss fights. Dazed and Confused keeps demons staggered for longer, which buys the player more time to execute glory kills, but in my opinion is not really needed. Ammo Boost increases the ammo received from drops, but ammo becomes so plentiful later on with upgrades that it is not needed. Now upgraded, there is a chance that BFG ammo may drop, which is somewhat useful. Equipment Power improves the effectiveness of all grenades. When upgraded, this will make the Siphon Grenade especially stronger. Useful rune all around. Seek and Destroy allows the player to initiate a glory kill from greater range, which is useful. Savagery increases the speed at which glory kills are performed, which does allow the player to get in and get out before they can be surrounded while performing a glory kill. In-flight mobility grants the player control while airborne, and in my opinion this is the best rune in the game. This freedom of movement while being airborne really improves the combat flow. Armor Defensive makes demons drop armor on glory kills, which is very useful and always makes glory kills effective. Blood Fueled gives the player a short speed boost after performing a glory kill, but is underwhelming at best. Becomes much improved in Doom Eternal. Intimacy is best, makes demons more resistant to damage when staggered, but seems out of place when you want demons to die and not linger on. Rich Gets Richer gives the player unlimited ammo when armor is at a certain threshold. Sounds overpowered to newer players, but it's really not needed if you ever use the chainsaw. Saving Throw allows the player to cheat death and recover health. This rune is acquired very late in the game. It is really most effective for newer players or an Ultra Nightmare playthrough. Now moving on to power-ups, which are these very scarce but exceptionally powerful buffs that the player can acquire in certain arena fights. There are a total of 4 of them, and beginning with Berserk. Berserk is a power-up that allows the player to instantly glory kill any demon within melee range. Extremely powerful as well as brutally entertaining. Haste. The Haste power-up increases the player movement speed and rate of fire with all weapons. With the speed boost that the player is granted, it is almost impossible for demons to land a successful attack. However, your ammo would disappear very quickly under the effect of this buff. Invulnerability. The Invulnerability power-up makes the player completely immune to all damage. This pickup is very rare compared to the others, but is really only needed in especially dangerous situations. Quad Damage. The Quad Damage is a power-up that grants the player an enormous damage boost. Practically anything fired upon will die unbelievably fast. However, one should proceed with caution, because this will also drastically increase the self-damage that the player is able to inflict upon themselves. And that you should be careful when using this power-up in that you could kill yourself extremely quickly if you are careless. Moving on to enemies, starting with those that are at the bottom of the food chain. The Unwilling, Possessed, and Possessed Engineer. These enemies are basically fodder, which can either be used to help regain health through glory kills, or help acquire weapon masteries. They pose little to no threat to the player. The Imp is a small, nimble, yet potentially dangerous demon early on in the game. Their AI allows them to maintain a level of randomness that can always keep the player guessing. The Possessed Soldier, tankier than the Imp but less agile, can pose a serious threat with their charged ranged orb attack, which is essentially this giant ball of plasma that, if it gets within proximity to the player, will detonate and do quite a bit of damage. The Possessed Security is an enemy that is similar to the soldier, yet wields a shield that can absorb a lot of damage, and has a shotgun as a firearm that is very deadly to the player at close range. However, later on, with the acquisition of stronger weapons, these weapons can easily break the shield and render this enemy practically useless. Moving on to the Hellraiser. The Hellraiser is a tankier version of the Possessed Soldier, but fires a precision beam that can deal a lot of damage. However, this attack is not much of a threat if the player learns to just stay on the move. The Hell Knight is a fairly tanky melee demon that can deal a lot of damage and has a powerful leap that will catch the player off guard without the proper movement. This enemy does become easier to handle later on in the game with the acquisition of the super shotgun. The Revenant is a mix between ground and aerial assault. It can fire off powerful rockets, but these can be easily evaded. It is tankier than the Possessed Soldier, but less than the Hell Knight. The Lost Soul is a kamikaze demon that can do a shit ton of damage to the player. However, they are easily dispatched if they are hit with any firearm. The Mancubus is a very tanky, long-range bombardment demon. They do have a flamethrower that they can use at close range, but are more effective at suppressing the player at a distance. However, they are very sluggish and can be outmaneuvered. The Summoner is similar to the Archvile of the classic Dooms. However, it does not resurrect demons, but it can summon them as reinforcements. They can also fire off a deadly wave of Argent Hell energy that can penetrate walls, and can teleport around the level fairly quickly to evade the player. This combination makes the Summoner extremely lethal, and it should be killed off as early in a fight as possible. The Pinky is a demon that has a thick armored carapace in front of its body, but it is vulnerable on its backside. This demon will constantly try to gore the player and knock you around, and in my opinion is potentially more annoying than deadly. If you can evade its charge and hit its backside, it can be easily dealt with. The Spectre is same as the Pinky, however, it is barely visible. In this case, it can become very deadly if the player lacks proper awareness. Moving on to the Cyber Mancubus. The Cyber Mancubus like the standard Mancubus. However, in this case it fires off a toxic green goop which does not explode, but essentially creates an area of denial for the player. With its cyber armor, it is tougher to kill and requires more effort on the part of the player to take down, but it is also sluggish like the Mancubus and can be outmaneuvered. The Cacodemon is an airborne, fairly tanky demon that will slowly move towards the player as it spits out large balls of purple bile. This demon, however, is only dangerous in that when it gets close to the player, it uses a very painful bite to attack you. However, if the player can deal with this demon at range, the less of a threat it is. Lastly, but certainly not least, of the non-bosses, the Baron of Hell is the highest rank of the Hell Knight class. They are the biggest and the strongest and are extremely tanky. They have the ability to throw green projectiles, which are quite painful, and these greater demons will deal severe damage to the player at range as well as in melee, and can just take severe amounts of punishment. This demon is easily the most dangerous of the non-boss roster. Moving on to bosses, beginning with the Cyber Demon. The Cyber Demon can fire off a flurry of missiles and can perform an aerial of bombardment effect. It can also make a quick dash towards the player, which can deal substantial amounts of melee damage. With his right arm, he can fling deadly energy waves at the player that the player must either crouch under or jump over to properly evade. One of his deadlier abilities is to erect a stone wall around the player, which confines their movement. It is possible to still evade his attacks in this phase, but it is deadly nonetheless. Another deadly ability is when he will slowly raise his left arm to fire a deadly beam of energy. This has to be evaded by strafing left or right and essentially changing your direction at the last possible second. Or the player can actually use the BFG to interrupt this attack, which is much easier. The Cyber Demon is not too difficult to defeat once you understand the fight, but he is not a pushover by any means. The Hell Guardians. In the first phase, you must only fight one, but this one has a shield up most of the time that will negate player damage. The boss can perform a leap slam towards the player. It can also fire off a bunch of fireball projectiles that will stay about the arena strafing around. It will also put up its shield and begin to spin around as beams of fire come out forth like spokes in a wheel, and the player must jump over these to avoid being damaged. When it begins to charge up a large orb of energy, this large orb can actually be destroyed with enough firepower and will actually stun the boss temporarily, allowing the player to put in more damage. In the second phase, you will be fighting two Hell Guardians at once. However, neither of them will have a shield during this phase. They will move around and strafe about the arena very quickly, so the player must keep track of their positions without getting overwhelmed. With proper movement and weapon switching, these bosses can be interrupted and burned down fairly quickly. They are deadlier than the Cyber Demon, but a lot less tankier. The final boss, the Spider Mastermind. The Spider Mastermind has several different and unique attacks. First, it can fire off a flurry of plasma projectiles. It can use a single powerful beam of energy, or put out an erratic array of multiple smaller energy beams. This boss also can lob out a large amount of grenades throughout the arena that the player must avoid. There is also a phase where the boss will erect these stone pillars from the ground, and that the ground will be perforated with this deadly purple mist. In order for the player to avoid being damaged by this, they must use these pillars and jump between them. In this phase, the player must deal a substantial amount of damage to interrupt this ability. What is unique is that this boss can actually fight right side up or upside down when performing these abilities. This makes it difficult for the player to actually damage the boss because you must land shots on her brain. As landing shots anywhere else on her body, she will take almost minimal to no damage. She also has a very painful melee attack to boot. Unlike the other two bosses, she feels more chaotic and unpredictable in her attack patterns. At the end of the fight, she will become crippled and a lot less mobile. The Spider Mastermind is very tanky and can deal a lot of damage and is fairly unpredictable. So I would argue that she is the most deadly of the three bosses. Now, moving on to my conclusion of my analysis of Doom 2016, where I will give my final praises as well as some critiques and complaints I have about the game. Doom 2016 is a fantastic return to the old school Doom formula. What sets it apart from other games is that it is able to engage the player on multiple levels. Things such as map navigation, resource management, execution of proper movement, using the appropriate weapons on the appropriate foes, and assessing which of those threats needs to be dealt with first. Things such as runes and Praetor suit upgrades can dynamically affect how the player engages in the combat. Also things such as when is it optimal to use a power-up in an arena fight? And all of this when the combat is moving at 90 miles an hour. Having to contest with all these factors at the same time is what makes Doom 2016 so exhilarating. It was my personal game of the year for the year of 2016, and it is an amazing game not just due to its quality, but because of how set apart it is and unique compared to other shooters on the market at the time of its release. Now, Doom Eternal would later go on to further refine, polish, and perfect the Doom formula. But for how Doom 2016 turned out, compared to what it could have been, is nothing short of astonishing. Now, while Doom 2016 is great in many departments, it does have some issues as well as my own personal nitpicks. One thing that the game was criticized for at the time of its launch was its loading times. I myself have a PS4 Pro and a 1 terabyte solid state drive. And the loading times compared to other games with similar mission structures is a bit slower compared to them. I can't imagine that without having a solid state drive, how tedious it would be really on a checkpoint time upon time if the player was dying a lot or was stuck in a hard section of the game. So I do consider this to be a valid complaint. Also, sometimes textures can appear to be washed out or not fully loaded in. This is most apparent in levels that take place on the surface of Mars or the Hell Dimension, and can be a bit underwhelming in certain spots. Certain weapons and weapon mods are either useless or basically redundant. The chain gun, in my opinion, is one of the worst offenders in that both of the firing modes seem to serve the same function and do not have a unique function apart from one another. The charge burst on the combat shotgun is made redundant when the player acquires the super shotgun, and this is doubly true for the standard firing mode. The only thing that does remain useful on the combat shotgun later on is the grenade launcher mod. The tactical scope mod for the heavy assault rifle is not useless, but the damage and ease of use compared to that of the micro missile mod completely overshadows it. Also, the sound of its standard firing mode sounds a bit weak and underwhelming. The plasma rifle also sounds weak and underwhelming, and actually feels pretty weak in combat. The stun bomb is really its best feature, and the heat blast is ultimately a bit too weak for its own good. Aesthetically, the plasma rifle is the most underwhelming gun in Doom 2016. The chainsaw has a great function, but the sound is a bit too high pitched and doesn't have the low roar in terms of the sound of a motor for a chainsaw of that magnitude. Also, some of the Praetor suit perks are either underwhelming or simply useless. Area scanning technology serves no purpose on repeated playthroughs, and mod swapping speed is a bit redundant. Runes are also a mixed bag. Some runes overlap in function, and others just aren't that useful. Due to the rune trials being spread out through most of the game, the ones that are most useful, and those that the player can take advantage of, are unfortunately only available until the player reaches a certain point in the main story. In combat, the combat wheel, at least for consoles, feels a bit sluggish and unresponsive. Yes, the player is compensated by having the time slowing down when using it. However, when you want to swap to another weapon quickly and get stuck fighting with the weapon wheel, it really interrupts the flow of Doom's fantastic combat. And another final nitpick is that when moving around in certain arenas, the player can get caught up on pieces of small geometry that really kind of throw a monkey wrench in the works. And while this does not happen in all arenas, however, it is exceptionally annoying when it does happen. That sums up my breakdown of Doom 2016. Now let's move on to Doom Eternal.
You were never one of us. You were nothing but a usurper, a false idol. My eyes have been opened. Let me help you to see, Slayer.
In the opening cinematic, the player is greeted with a familiar shot of the planet Mars. where the previous Doom had mostly taken place. As the camera moves past the red planet, we witness the worldwide, planet-ending devastation that the demonic invasion has caused on Earth. Yet in classic Doom presentation, it is once again the Doom Slayer who shall be the one to stand against the many and strike down this demon invasion. When the player first gains control of the Doom Slayer, they are greeted with demonic iconography and symbolism, that much that is akin to the look and feel of Doom 1 and 2. At the end of this brief introduction, the Slayer kills the first of the three Hell Priests and proceeds to exit the evil citadel. As the Slayer recovers from his fall, we are not able to see in painful detail how devastated planet Earth now is. As the absolutely enormous Demon Titan slowly lumbers away, the player is beginning to come to terms that the journey ahead of the Slayer will be the most difficult journey yet. Unlike the previous Doom entry, Doom Eternal does not try to give a dark and foreboding atmosphere, neither does it try to appear grounded or believable. Instead, it blatantly strives for the completely impossible and utterly fantastical aesthetic. The Slayer's suit, weapons, and enemies are even more brutal and extreme in their appearance. The graphical fidelity in Doom Eternal somehow is able to turn everything up to 11. Textures are more detailed, geometry more complex, physics-based lighting gives every surface a unique appearance. Particle effects are simply jaw-dropping and more plentiful than before. And of course, this runs at a nice and smooth 60 frames a second at 1080p on the console platforms, which is an impressive feat. In Doom Eternal, the enemy damage and dismemberment that was present in the previous entry has been overhauled. Not only has death and dismemberment been given more attention, but impact physics will now dynamically affect enemies even after death. Also, during combat, enemies will begin to show damage on their models as they suffer more and more punishment by the player, in comically and gruesome detail. This also helps serve the function to help the player quickly identify how close an enemy is to dying. Levels in Doom Eternal are very large, which helps establish the size and scope of the Doom Eternal setting. But it also helps service the gameplay, especially in the combat arenas. Levels this time around, generally speaking, have a more direct approach in progression, yet are vast enough to make the player feel like they could get lost within them. Secrets and collectibles, for the most part, are clearly shown to the player in some form or fashion that helps the player learn of their presence. But the paths to actually reaching these secrets are still up to the player to discover. The Doom Slayer now has a central hub, the Fortress of Doom, which serves as his base of operations. The fortress serves many functions, as all secrets and collectibles that the Slayer collects on his journey can be used to help unlock weapon mods, Praetor suit tokens, and Sentinel crystals to empower the Slayer, as well as different Praetor suits that can be worn for the Slayer. Some of the collectibles can be admired or used if the player needs some downtime in between Doom Eternal's intense gameplay. The Repertorium is a combat arena the Fortress of Doom provides as a place for the player to comfortably and safely experiment with the new control scheme, weapons, equipment, and even help complete weapon masteries if need be. Navigation is a bit more in-depth this time around as the player has much more to contend with in between fights. There are rough surfaces that the Slayer can grab to climb up and down, or bars that can be swung upon to give a boost in momentum and jump height. Environmental hazards and traps, which appear sporadically throughout, help add tensions to the map navigation. Such areas may contain radioactive material, and that the player has to find a radioactive suit to equip to help mitigate this damage. Also, there will sometimes be a purple goo that, if the player comes into contact with, will completely prevent the use of jumping or dashing until the player is safely away from it. While platforming is much more abundant in Doom Eternal, if the player fails, they are simply teleported back to the start of the platforming section and are penalized with a loss of armor or health, instead of dying and having to reload at checkpoint. Just as the look and feel of Doom Eternal has become more brutal, so has its sound effects department. Environments have increased in scope and size, and in like have been compensated by adding a plethora of detail. Areas like Exhaustive can feel immersive as a flag nearby wavers in the wind, or the crashing sound of a distant yet immense waterfall. In Necroval, the wailing of souls can be heard off far in the distance, just as the fiery embers breeze across the Doomslayer's gaze. Classic enemies like the Imp, Mancubus, and Baron of Hell sound just as impressive as before, and the new enemies like the Doom Hunter, an unholy combination of demonic flesh and industrial-grade alloys, comes crushing through like a tank. Other new foes like the Prowler puts off a unique sound when teleporting around the level, always keeping the player on their toes in anticipation of being flanked. The Marauder makes wrathful grunts when pursuing the Slayer, and the Argent Energy axe he wields sounds like it melts the air as he swings it towards you. The sound effects of Doom Slayer's arsenal is somehow even more devastating than before, almost as if the Slayer's hatred towards demonkind is now infused into his weaponry. The heavy cannon this time around puts off a satisfying deep thud with every round fired, and the Precision Scope mod mimics the noise of an old World War II 20mm anti-tank cannon. The plasma rifle now feels like a powerful volley of unstable plasma ready to melt down demon flesh at any opportunity. The Ballista has a nice, high-powered robotic quake to its every shot, and the Destroyer Blade modifier feels unsettling as its plasma energy within becomes more unstable the more tension it builds up. The Flame Belch feels like it puts out a quick dose of napalm hot enough to melt metal into a vapor. Once again, Mick Gordon returns with a unique and distinctive soundtrack for the Doom series. When exploring levels like Exaltia or Taras Nabad, you experience a somber feeling that implies these ancient ruins were once a living testament of a civilization that will know greatness no more, and that their great history will remain forgotten. And other levels like Necrovol, Mick Gordon is able to capture the feeling that the harvesting and consumption of souls has been around since time immemorial. The sound for Urdak feels almost mind-bending, like entering some bizarre, forgotten outer plane of an obscure god in the Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms setting. The combat tracks put even more of an emphasis on the heavy metal genre, and really help pull the player into the blistering speed of combat. The music feels like it is trying to tell the player a tale, an ancient prophecy of the Doomslayer's appointed time, when he will reign supremely undisputed as the eternal protector of Earth and all of mankind. That the Slayer cannot be stopped, neither his thirst be quenched, or his wrath be calmed. He cannot be defeated because it is in his nature to be victorious. To say that these tracks are nothing short of incredible would be a crime against the FPS genre. In Doom 2016's story, I analyzed more of the Slayer's character as well as the meta-narrative, as there was not much to the main plot. However, Doom Eternal adds a lot more to the Doom setting, so this section will be somewhat long-winded. Doom Eternal, unlike its predecessor, makes a big effort trying to establish a Doom universe. While the plot has some potentially interesting things going on in the background, the main plot is fairly straightforward. However, much is revealed in the Codex entries. By the time the game begins, Earth has been in conflict with the demon invasion for untold months. The Slayer must kill 3 Hell Priests in order to interrupt something that is called the Final Blood Ritual. We learn from Codex entries that the Hell Dimension seek out new mortal worlds to conquer and eventually use mortals and their souls to help create more demon kind and more Hell energy. So for Earth to be saved, the Slayer must seek out and kill all 3 Hell Priests to end this ritual and save humanity from damnation. However, during the Slayer's journey, he encounters a creature known as the Conmaker, who demands the Slayer cease what he is doing. Naturally, the Slayer ignores her demands. Following this, we learn more about the Slayer's history as a Knight Sentinel and his service to the people of Argent D'Nur, and an apparently interplanetary civilization which either ceased to exist entirely or is a shadow of what its civilization used to be. More than halfway through Doom Eternal, we discover that long ago, the people of Argent D'Nur and the Makers, who are an extremely old, highly technologically advanced godlike alien species, had a long relationship between their respective civilizations. The Makers served as their masters, or perhaps gods, and the people of Argent D'Nur served them in exchange for their gifts of wisdom, knowledge, power, and technology. The best I can describe this setting is that species like humanity and the Argenta exist in the middle dimension. Makers exist in a higher dimension, and demonkind exists in a lower dimension. Demons cannot enter the Maker dimension, and the Makers cannot enter the Hell dimension. However, they can mingle in the middle dimension, and this is essential for the creation of Argent energy later on. One day, the person who we know of as the Doomslayer somehow stumbled upon the people of Argent D'Nur. In their discovery of this outlander, the Argenta people had first treated the Slayer with disdain, fear, and suspicion. But the Slayer was slowly able to prove himself to the Argentan people and would eventually be the warrior king of the Knight Sentinels later on. However, because of the Slayer's appearance, the Khan Maker, curious, uses her minions to study the Slayer and learn of what he knows about the Hell Dimension and the planet called Earth. Through this discovery, the Hell Dimensions eventually begin to invade Argent D'Nur, and naturally, the Slayer joins them in their defense to help fight the denizens of Hell. Later on, through treachery and deception, the Khan Maker, through the service of the Order of Daig, studies the energies and magics of the Hell Dimension, and at some point later on, makes an evil deal that leads to the creation of the city of Necroval to help create Argent energy for the Makers. The Makers are in need of this Argent energy due to the absence of some entity referred to as the Father. Perhaps an ancient progenitor of their species, or perhaps a godlike being that uplifted their civilization. Without the assistance of the Father's essence, the Makers, even though extraordinarily long-lived, will eventually suffer from something called the Transfiguration, where they will slowly begin to enter a mental and biological degradation. The supply of Argent energy from Hell can stave off this process. So in a nutshell, the Makers assist the Hell dimension in finding new worlds to be consumed, that Hell may create new demons out of the mortals, and use their souls to create Argent energy for both parties. At some point in Sentinel history, under the leadership of the Doomslayer, the Knight Sentinels made a discovery on one of their war campaigns in the Hell dimension. In this discovery, it was revealed to them the hidden dealings that the Khan Maker was making with the denizens of Hell. They saw factories made to create Argent energy through the torturing and consumption of mortal souls were made of Sentinel and Maker technology combined. This caused a great schism within the people of Argenta, and a civil war broke out. Later on, the Doomslayer planned to lead a group of Knight Sentinels to destroy Necroval and deny Hell and the Makers their highly prized Argent energy. However, in this moment, the Priest of Daig interfered and caused the portals to Hell to displace the Knight Sentinels, scattering them all over the Hell dimension without a way back home. This primarily was made possible by the Knight Sentinel commander, Valen, whom is known as the Betrayer, who, in desperation to see his son resurrected and spared from the tortures of Hell. For his betrayal, his son was resurrected as promised, but through a cruel trick was resurrected as the icon of sin. His soul now exists transmogrified and entombed within a beating heart. Later on, when the Doomslayer kills all three Hell Priests, the Khan Maker, out of desperation, tries to revive the icon of sin to consume Earth. The Slayer makes his way to Urdak, where he destroys the heart of the Betrayer's son, that he may rest in peace. He then eventually defeats the Khan Maker in combat, and makes his final journey back to Earth to fight the Icon of Sin. As the Doomslayer rages across the destroyed cityscape and wages war against the Icon of Sin, he is eventually successful in slaying the Great Titan, and the Earth is finally saved from the demonic invasion. Some interesting things to note about the narrative before I move on. There is no mention of what happens to the Slayer between the ending of Doom 2016 or the beginning of Doom Eternal, or how he comes into the possession of the Fortress of Doom. I understand why this was perhaps not covered in the main story, just to get the ball rolling and allow the player access to the Fortress of Doom at the beginning of the game. Hopefully, this will be addressed later on in DLC. Further, there are notes I would like to point out about the Doomslayer himself. When the Slayer meets the ghost or spectral form of King Novik, he kneels before him, even though disregarding his commands to cease on his quest to save humanity. This can be seen as a sign of respect, honor, or perhaps adhering to the chain of command, and the Slayer recognizes his position as a superior officer. As we know, the Slayer himself is a former soldier. According to the similarity in voice, it would seem that the man who speaks about the Slayer at the very beginning of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, as well as the very ending of Doom Eternal, is in fact King Novik himself. When the Slayer meets the Betrayer face to face, he mentions that saving your people will not bring you peace, only make the burden you carry worse. This adds to my theory that the Slayer has an earnest desire to defend humanity, that he is not just fulfilling his own personal quest of vengeance. The Betrayer also states that now it is time for the Slayer's people to give penance. I would assume this was referring to the harvesting of the earth to sustain the Makers. King Novik also makes the same statement. Lastly, the Betrayer says, "Hear me, Slayer. When you have laid his heart to rest, then his soul will be at peace, and so will mine." The way this last line of dialogue comes off is it makes me wonder if the Slayer had a conversation recently with the Betrayer, perhaps sometime before the start of Doom Eternal. I believe this cutscene also shows a level of compassion on the Slayer's part. Commander Valen was the man responsible for the betrayal of the Night Sentinels that the Slayer led in an attempt to destroy Necroval, and their scattering in the Hell Dimension without a way back. The Slayer does not seek vengeance on the Betrayer and instead agrees to grant the soul of his son peace. There is also another cutscene that shows the Maker by the name of Seraphim, who leads the Slayer to the Divinity Machine. The Seraphim is also apparently responsible for stealing the essence of the Father from the Makers, and shortly thereafter disappears and his whereabouts are unknown. There is not much to go on, but it makes you curious as to what the Divinity Machine actually did to the Doomslayer, other than obviously making him more powerful. Also, what is the Seraphim plotting and why? An interesting note is that the Betrayer and the Seraphim are both mentioned in the Doomslayer Testament writings in the Hell Dimension of 2016. The biggest and most significant plot reveal is that, in a flashback in Sentinel Prime, it shows us that the Doomslayer is the same person from Doom 1, 2, and Doom 64. This theory was speculated by many fans of the Doom series, including myself. This, I feel, adds more questions than answers, assuming the events of the previous Doom game are of course canon and in which time they did occur. Moving on to gameplay. Now, with the sheer amount of stuff that Doom Eternal has crammed into its combat and its systems, this section is going to be fairly long-winded. Starting with movement, in Doom Eternal, movement is the same as it is with Doom 2016, but with some new features. The player is granted the ability to perform a dash, which is a brief yet quick boost of movement in any direction. The dash is useful for quickly getting out of a hairy situation or to simply allow the player some breathing room. It can also be used to help close the distance on enemies to perform a glory kill or increase the damage potential of certain weapons. The dash, when upgraded, has a fast enough cooldown to be used often enough to simply just move around the level. Dash is also needed to get past certain platforming sections. There is also the introduction of monkey bars, which are used in combat and platforming alike. When swung upon, the player is given a small boost in momentum and given some extra altitude. Interesting to note is that when a player uses a monkey bar or performs a glory kill while in midair, the player's secondary jump is refreshed, allowing for more hang time. Unlike the previous entry, some enemy attacks are so fast that strafing is not quick enough to evade, and dash will need to be used instead. Moving on to the Doomslayer's weaponry, beginning with the combat shotgun. The combat shotgun is a close-range weapon that is effective at quickly dispatching weaker demons at close range. The full auto mod provides a huge boost in DPS with this weapon, but burns through ammo fairly quickly. When fully upgraded, it can make demons drop ammo on kill. This is a decent mod for close range sustained DPS, however, the super shotgun will often be more effective use of shotgun ammo. The sticky bomb mod allows the combat shotgun to fire explosive sticky grenades that can kill weaker demons with indirect splash damage, and instantly destroy enemy weak points if placed with an accurate shot. When fully upgraded, this mod is able to fire 5 sticky bombs before recharging. This mod is most effective on killing weaker demons and destroying enemy weak points. However, this mod will become less effective against stronger demons later on. Heavy Cannon. The Heavy Cannon is a mid to long range weapon that is effective at killing weaker demons with precision shots. The Micro Missile mod fires small explosive projectiles that can eliminate weaker demons fairly quickly and can acquire their target just as easily. When fully upgraded, the Micro Missile mod will deploy faster, receive a damage boost if the player has killed an enemy recently with the standard firing mode, and of course, with the mastery, can fire an unlimited supply of missiles without having to recharge. The Precision Bolt mod is a highly powerful, highly precise firing mode that deals incredible damage, especially when hitting enemy weak points. This mod, when fully upgraded, will set off a blast wave that will damage nearby demons if the Slayer is able to successfully perform a headshot. This weapon mod becomes exceptionally powerful when combined with weapon switching. And compared to micro missiles are decent and are user-friendly, however, they don't have that good of a DPS later on in the game, and the Precision Bolt mod is better for burst damage as well as more efficient with ammo. Plasma Rifle. The Plasma Rifle is a short to medium range, high rate of fire weapon that sends out a volley of plasma projectiles. The standard firing mod can rapidly dispatch weaker demons and even take down stronger demons at a decent range if most rounds hit the target. The microwave mod can lock onto a target and keep it stationary as it burns through ammo and eventually kills it. Player movement is noticeably decreased when using this mode. When fully upgraded, the range and charge time of the beam is much improved and will set off a concussive blast when it kills a target. This firing mode is good for locking down a problematic demon, particularly an agile one. However, this mod burns through a lot of ammo relative to the damage it is dealing, even when fully upgraded. It is user-friendly to newer players, but the movement speed reduction is a strong penalty to contend with, especially on higher difficulties. The Heat Blast mod will charge up over time as the player consumes plasma ammo. When the charged blast is used, it will deal a decent damage in front of the player in a cone shape. When fully upgraded, the heat wave builds up faster, and when used, gives the standard firing mode a short damage boost for a short period of time. Heat Blast is likely to be used over the microwave beam as it provides better DPS and is more efficient with the use of plasma ammo. The Heat Blast mod, for instance, can actually take out a Doom Hunter shield when fully charged, and is easily the more useful of the two. Rocket Launcher. The Rocket Launcher is a powerful, high explosive weapon that can kill demons with indirect splash damage, and stronger demons with direct hits. The Remote Detonation mod allows players to detonate a rocket in mid-flight, which is useful to help maximize splash damage potential. When upgraded, this mod will keep demons staggered and set off additional explosives if demons are within proximity of the rocket. This mod is extremely effective at dealing with large clusters of weaker demons, however is not as effective on stronger demons. The lock-on burst is a firing mode that will lock on to a target and fire 3 homing rockets. When fully upgraded, it can put out a huge amount of burst damage and be effective at killing stronger demons even in the late game. This becomes incredibly powerful when combined with weapon switching. Super Shotgun. The Super Shotgun is an extremely powerful, close-range weapon that can outright demolish weaker demons and stronger demons alike. It only has one firing mode, but has a unique attachment called the meat hook. The meat hook can be used to close in on a target to maximize the Super Shotgun's damage. It can also be used to reach enemies to perform glory kills, chainsaw kills for ammunition, or simply be used as a movement tool in combat. When fully upgraded, the meat hook cooldown is reduced, reload speed is increased, and the meat hook will actually set enemies on fire that will aid the player in obtaining armor. This weapon is exceptionally powerful when used in weapon switching. Ballista. The Ballista is a very powerful, very precise plasma weapon that is effective against any demon at any range. Its Arbalist firing mode can charge to increase damage and set off an explosive after the projectile makes contact. When fully upgraded, the player can move at full speed and the projectile's explosion will become even larger. The DPS of this firing mode becomes much higher with the weapon mastery, as the Arbalist will charge quickly after landing a direct hit. This mod is practically strong against any demon at any range, and even more so if striking weak points. The Destroyer Blade firing mode will charge up and shoot out a wide area of effect energy crescent that will instantly kill weaker demons to moderate demons and deal heavy damage and falter stronger demons on hit. When fully upgraded, this firing mode will have increased charge time, emit a blast wave that will stagger nearby demons at full charge, and even be able to fire as being charged incrementally instead of having to wait for a full charge. This is effective at dealing a big area of effect, damage, and large groups of demons. However, the player's movement becomes extremely slow when charging this attack, a very deadly penalty on higher difficulties, and is best used in combination with something like the freeze grenade. Chain Gun. The Chain Gun is a medium-range, high rate of fire weapon that can shred weaker demons and constantly stagger and kill stronger demons at a decent pace. The Energy Shield mod will erect a shield in front of the player that will absorb a set amount of damage over a short period of time. This is effective at reducing damage taken, and when timed correctly, can be helpful with negating the damage of the most dangerous of demon abilities. When fully upgraded, the recharge time of the shield is reduced, and the shield can be used to stagger demons with either a dash or firing off the shield if enough damage is dealt. The mobile turret is a firing mode that deals additional damage at the cost of faster ammo consumption. This firing mode, when used correctly, can suppress and slay the strongest of demon kind. When fully upgraded, the turret will deploy faster, the player's speed movement will no longer be penalized, and will no longer overheat. Both of these firing mods are useful and have their own unique strengths. However, the Energy Shield will be more desired for players playing on a higher difficulty. BFG 9000. The BFG 9000 is an extremely powerful, extremely large area of effect weapon that can vaporize almost any but the strongest of demon kind. This weapon is best used to kill large groups of demons or helping damage and interrupt boss attacks. Should only be used when absolutely needed. Unmaker. The Unmaker is an extremely powerful, high rate of fire weapon that actually uses the same ammo as the BFG 9000. This weapon is more efficient in the use of Argent ammo, but most damaging perhaps to, let's say, close range of a large, stronger demon, or at medium range when firing at multiple weaker demons. Equipment Launcher. The Equipment Launcher is a Praetor suit shoulder-mounted ordnance system that can be used to activate 3 different firing modes. The Frag Grenade is a high area of effect, high damage explosive that can outright kill weaker demons or stagger stronger demons. When fully upgraded, it can store up to 2 charges, have the cooldown reduced, and set off additional explosive fragments when demons are killed by it. This firing mod can keep stronger demons stun locked if the frag grenades are properly timed apart from each other. The freeze grenade is a medium area of effect explosive that freezes any demon caught in its blast zone. While the freeze itself deals no damage, it can be used to lock down a target for a devastating attack or to simply give the player time to focus on something else. When fully upgraded, this firing mode will have a reduced cooldown, freeze demons for longer, drop health on enemies' death, and increase the damage dealt to frozen demons. This firing mode is extremely useful at helping burning down demons that are the most dangerous. Flame Belch is a flamethrower mod that will ignite demons in a moderately sized area in front of the player. Demons when on fire will slowly drop armor over time, drop even more armor when they are killed under its effect, and when fully upgraded it has a reduced cooldown, lasts longer on stronger demons, and will drop more armor. This mod is most effective on large packs of demons, and proper use of this mod is essential to survival, especially on higher difficulties. Melee. Standard melee attacks this time around are even weaker than before. They can briefly stagger a weaker demon, but deal practically no damage. The Blood Punch is a supercharged melee attack that can outright kill weaker demons and heavily damage stronger demons. It is effective when used against heavily armored demons, and when combined with the Punch and Reave rune, it will drop additional health when demons are killed by it. It can create a shockwave that will stagger nearby demons as well later on in the game, and it is best reserved when fighting certain enemies or to help create some breathing room when the player gets surrounded. Chainsaw. The chainsaw this time around is primarily used to help the player replenish their ammo. It can be used to instantly kill certain heavy demons, but is best used on fodder demons for much needed supplies. Crucible. The Crucible is easily the most powerful weapon in the game, as it can kill any demon with one swipe, yet can only store 3 charges before needing to be resupplied. This weapon is best used for the most dangerous of demons. Glory Kills. Glory Kills make their return from Doom 2016 and serve the same function. However, it should be noted that on higher difficulties, enemies are much more aggressive and will take the opportunity to surround the player when using a Glory Kill. It can be used to potentially avoid damage if timed correctly. However, one should take note of their surroundings before engaging in a Glory Kill animation. As, for example, doing this near a Baron of Hell or Mancubus can make the player quickly lose any health that the Glory Kill provided. In mid-air, Glory Kills can also reset the player dash and secondary jump, which can be used to maintain hang time when airborne. Moving on to Praetor suit upgrades, runes, Sentinel crystals, power-ups, and extra lives. Starting with the Praetor suit, environment category, hazard protection improves the effectiveness of rad suits and makes them last longer in toxic areas. This is a nice convenience factor, but it is not needed. Thicker skin makes the player immune from damage dealt by exploding barrels. This is perhaps more useful on higher difficulties to avoid killing oneself, but is decent for newer players learning the ropes. Regenerating barrels. Barrels that are destroyed will respawn after a short period of time. This is useful depending on the arena, but its usefulness is limited. Explosive pinatas. Exploding barrels will drop ammo, and of course having more ammo is always useful, but proper use of the chainsaw negates the use of this upgrade. Category Exploration. Slayer Atlas will reveal the automap station location on the automap, and this is perhaps helpful for newer players trying to navigate the area. Item Classifier. This reveals all progression items on the dossier. This is helpful when trying to identify what collectibles the player is missing. Bigger fog lights. Grants a larger automap reveal radius, useful when trying to identify particular secrets. Item Finder. Reveals the position of all progressive items on the auto map. This is a big convenience factor when trying to collect all the collectibles on a singular map. While these suit upgrades are more effective than they were in Doom 2016, these perks are relatively useless on repeated playthroughs. Category fundamentals. Grappler, faster ledge and monkey bar interaction. This is useful to help maintain speed in combat. Hot Swapper, increases the speed of switching weapons and weapon mods. This is incredibly useful, especially in high tier gameplay. Faster Dasher, increases the rate at which dash refills. This is incredibly useful and quite self-explanatory. Hit and Run, dash refills on glory kills. This is most effective when either quickly dashing to an enemy to glory kill them before they break out of their stun, or perhaps doing it while airborne, that the player can maintain hang time even after performing a glory kill. Category Ice Bomb, faster ice cooldown, very useful, self-explanatory. Permafrost, demons remain frozen for longer, very useful in giving the player more time to DPS and burn down a demon. Ice Drops, damaging and killing demons will drop health. This helps the player stay alive, pretty obvious. Frostbite, damage dealt against frozen demons is increased. This is extremely powerful when dealing with the problematic demons and trying to eliminate them off the chessboard as soon as possible. Frag Grenade, faster frag cooldown, reduces the recharge time on frag grenades, very useful, self-explanatory. Combustion Concussion, frag grenades emit a second, larger, non-damaging explosion that staggers enemies. This helps when being overwhelmed or keeping stronger demons at bay. Scatter Bombs, creates smaller explosive fragments for every demon killed. This is incredibly powerful at destroying larger groups of weaker demons. Frag Stock Up, allows the player to store 2 charges for the frag grenade. This is stronger than you may imagine, as while the burst damage is good, this can help players stun lock more dangerous demons when the frag grenades are timed apart appropriately. Moving on to runes. Starting with Savagery, glory kills are performed much faster, useful in reducing the time other demons have to catch up to the player during the glory kill animation. Seek and Destroy, allows the player... Seek and Destroy allows the player to initiate glory kills from further away. Useful, but when upgraded, dash refills so fast that it can be used instead to close the distance and then refill after the glory kill animation. Blood Fueled, grants the player a noticeable boost in speed after a glory kill. This is useful to help quickly reposition or simply evade enemy attacks during the speed boost. Air Control, grants more control while airborne, extremely useful and the best rune in my opinion. Dazed and Confused, increases the duration of the enemy's stun. This is most useful for performing specific glory kills, depending on what the mission challenge is. Saving Throw, this allows the player to cheat death once, useful for newer players or on a Ultra Nightmare playthrough. Chrono Strike, slows down time mid-air for a short duration. This is helpful when trying to land precision shots, but has to recharge after use. Equipment Fiend, this reduces the cooldown of equipment if demons are killed by or under the influence of when they perish. This is very useful and it is the second best rune in my opinion. Punch and Reeve, when killed by Blood Punch, enemies will drop health, and this can be a powerful combo when combined with Health for Blood, as this will allow the player to chain some blood punches in quick succession. Sentinel Crystal Upgrades, Quick Draw Belch, reduces the cooldown of Flame Belch, very useful to help maintain armor. Loot Magnet, increases the radius at which resources can be picked up, great for snagging drops when trying to maintain a fast pace during fights. Napalm Belch, heavy and super heavy demons stay on fire longer. This is useful, but it is better to use the Flame Belch on groups of weaker demons if possible. Health for Blood and Armor for Blood. Armor and health pickups will help refill the blood punch, which is fairly useful. These abilities are most effective if the player is good at avoiding damage most of the time. Belch armor boost. Demons drop armor at a faster rate. Very useful, plain and simple. Power-ups. This time around, power-ups are a lot more scarce. However, they can be extended the more demons the player kills. This encourages the player to be even more aggressive. Onslaught is the first power-up, and it increases the damage of all weapons. Simple, but should be careful when using this, as any self-damage, or particularly that of exploding barrels, will increase your self-damage and potentially kill you, so proceed with caution. Overdrive. This will give the player a huge speed boost in movement and grants all weapons, except for the BFG and Unmaker, infinite ammo. Very powerful when combined with high ammo consumption weapon mods like the lock-on rocket launcher or the mobile turret chain gun. Berserker. Allows the player to instantly melee kill any demon. While this is very powerful, the player can still be damaged with this buff and should be careful not to be too careless when using it. Extra lives. This will restore the player to full health at the same position of their expected death. This is useful for newer players on higher difficulties, or perhaps people who want to breeze through the game. However, it is not needed once the player becomes familiar with the game's mechanics. Moving onwards to enemies, starting with the Arachnotron. This is a heavy yet very nimble demon that can overwhelm the player with its heavy turret placed over its brain. This turret, however, can be destroyed and makes the demon less dangerous. However, this demon is fairly quick and agile and can walk upon walls and ceilings. So while not very tanky, landing shots can be difficult as it has a tendency to dodge around a lot. So while it is elusive, it is still an aggressive demon and is dangerous early on, but becomes easier to handle in the later game. Archvile. This super heavy demon can summon in more demon reinforcements in the middle of combat, which can be extremely deadly. It also has the ability to teleport around the map to evade the player. It will place up a firewall when summoning demons, so the player must flank around him to cause harm. This demon can also send out powerful waves of hell energy that can be difficult to evade. However, the player can use Blood Punch to destroy most of its armor, making it easier to take down. This demon only appears in the late game, yet is extremely dangerous at all times and is extremely tanky. Should be killed as soon as possible. Moving on to the Baron of Hell. This is a very powerful, very tanky melee demon that will constantly pursue the player and pressure them. This demon can throw projectiles of hell energy, but prefers to melee the player instead. This demon can be avoided with proper movement, but should never be underestimated or lost sight of in the middle of a fight. It should be eliminated earlier rather than later during combat. The Caco Demon. The Caco Demon is a moderately tanky airborne demon that will constantly fire projectiles of purple bile at the player. This demon will always slowly but steadily move closer to the player and will use a painful bite when in range. This becomes this becomes more dangerous the closer that the Cackle Demon gets to the player, and should be dealt with at range. Moderately dangerous. The Carcass. The Carcass is a medium-sized demon that plays more of a support role, as it will erect energy shields to block the player's line of fire or even path of movement. It can also shoot out a painful shockwave of energy towards the player. This not in itself dangerous, can really be a nuisance to the player when trying to take down other more dangerous demons. It should be prioritized early in the fight, or using a plasma rifle will negate the shield. More annoying than it is dangerous. Cue Ball. Basically, this is a fodder demon that can be punted as a faster moving explosive on contact. Possesses little to no threat to the player. Cyber Mancubus. A tankier, more dangerous version of the standard Mancubus, this demon's focus is more on long-range bombardment and area denial. It does not have a flamethrower like its lesser brethren, but it can still use a painful knockback attack if the player gets too close. The player can use Blood Punch to destroy its armor, making it easier to take down. However, using close range attacks like the Blood Punch or a shotgun, it is better if the player can do this while airborne, as the area of denial attack can be avoided while in the air. Fairly dangerous and should be eliminated early in the fight. The Doom Hunter. This is a super heavy demon and is extremely tanky but surprisingly agile for its size. It can easily move around the arenas as well as dash side to side to evade attacks. It can fire off a flurry of rockets towards the player as well as use lock-ons with a separate attack that must be evaded. It wields a large double chainsaw bladed arm that can do a lot of damage in melee range. Players should do their best to focus fire on its sled, as his upper body is shielded while upon it. Weapons such as the chain gun, mobile turret, or ballista arbalest can make short work of this sled. Blood Punch is also useful for destroying the sled as well. Extremely dangerous, but can be properly avoided with good movement to focus on other demons. Very dangerous at all times. Dread Knight. This is a tanky, fairly powerful demon that can launch out hell energy projectiles and leap towards the player, creating a very painful area of effect upon landing. This demon is a stronger version of the Hell Knight, but not as tanky as the Baron of Hell. However, it is potentially more dangerous as it leaps at the player more aggressively and puts down a damaging ground effect upon each leap. So this demon should be focused on and killed quickly, as it can make certain fights more complicated for the player. Fairly dangerous at all times. The Gargoyle. A weaker yet highly agile and aerial demon. This demon can spew out green toxic projectiles while airborne, and will sometimes get behind the player to perform a flurry of melee attacks. This demon takes very little effort to kill, but is highly evasive enough and somewhat of a nuisance. Can pose a minor to a moderate threat to the player. The Hell Knight. A tanky melee demon that will aggressively pursue the player at all times. This demon is dangerous in melee range, but poses no threat at range. Should not be underestimated, as it can box the player in if not kept track of. Moderately dangerous. The End. This is a weak but fairly agile demon that has a fairly rapid and accurate fire of projectiles that it can lob at the player. Like the Gargoyle, it is fairly weak, but it becomes more dangerous in large groups. Can pose a minor to moderate threat to the player. The Lost Soul. This is a kamikaze demon that can cause a shit ton of damage if it makes contact with the player. However, it can be easily dispatched with the smallest amount of firearm damage. This can pose a high threat to the player if not dealt with properly. The Mancubus. The Mancubus is a fairly tanky, long-range bombardment demon. It has a deadly flamethrower that it can use in close range, and as well use a knockback area of denial attack if the player gets too close. Its cannons can be destroyed with precision shots, making it less dangerous. However, this demon remains moderately dangerous throughout the entire game, so treat with caution. The Marauder. This is a super heavy demon that is notorious for being incredibly hard to kill if not dealt with properly. It has a shield that can be used to negate any damage by the player. If the player wastes too much time trying to shoot or suppress the Marauder when his shield is raised, he will conjure a spectral hound to pursue the player, this freeing up his ability to attack or reposition. If the player gets too close, he will use his shotgun to pulverize you. He can also throw out waves of hell energy with his axe. The best way to deal with this demon is to wait until the Marauder is about at medium range before shooting him. Contrary to what the Codex says, you do not need to wait until his eyes flash green to attack. Instead, you can look at how he runs at the player and when he is going to use his melee attack. When you become familiar with this animation, then you know you can safely fire upon him without using his shield, without him using the shield. Things like a frag grenade or remote detonation rocket launcher or even the sticky bombs of the combat shotgun can get past his shield and stagger him, opening up a moment for the player to attack. Using the super shotgun in combination with the ballista is the best way to get out as much damage as quickly as possible before the Marauder can recover. The key to defeating the Marauder is exercising a little bit of patience. Players who get too eager will make this demon a lot more dangerous than it needs to be. The Marauder can even be evaded in larger fights if the player simply uses the arena carefully and makes sure not to suppress him, enforcing him and spawning a Spectral Hound. This demon is fairly dangerous at all times. Maker Drone. This enemy appears in the late game and is more of a nuisance than a threat. If killed with a precision headshot, it will drop a lot of health and ammunition. But, of course, it will take less damage if shot in the body. It is also capable of performing a quick dash to evade enemy gunfire. Not much of a threat, but can be annoying to deal with. The Mecha Zombie. This is a slow demon that is a bit tankier than the possessed soldier, and it can fire off-range projectiles or use a flamethrower if the player is at close range, and this does deal decent damage. However, it poses little to no threat to the player. Pain Elemental. This is a very tanky aerial demon that will conjure up lost souls and hurl them at the player. This can be very dangerous, but weapons like the rocket launcher, sticky bomb, shotgun, or Arbalest ballista can destroy the lost souls instantly upon contact. It of course has a painful melee attack if the player is within range. It can also use a dodge ability to make it harder to land shots on. Best to eliminate this demon early on, as the lost souls can deal a shit ton of damage to the player. Pinky. This heavy demon has a highly armored carapace on the front side of its body, but is completely vulnerable on its backside. It will constantly try to gore the player as it charges. However, if the player stays too close to the Pinky, it will rotate around to perform melee attacks. So the player must wait for it to charge and then counterattack and fire upon its weak backside. The Prowler. This demon is a moderately tanky, yet extremely agile and evasive opponent. It will constantly teleport around the map, making it harder for the player to keep track of. It prefers to flank the player instead of fighting you head on. This demon is more of an opportunist, waiting for the right moment to ambush the player. It can be fairly dangerous if the player cannot react quickly enough to its teleporting attacks. The meat hook shotgun combo is effective at locking this demon down and putting an end to it rather quickly. The Revenant. This is a moderately tanky demon and is a mixture of ground and aerial combat. It has 2 rocket turrets that can lock onto the player and deal decent damage. However, these turrets can be destroyed with precision shots. The Revenant also has some painful melee attacks if the player gets too close. This demon possesses a moderate threat to the player, but can easily be dealt with. The Soldier Blaster. This weaker demon is equipped with a Plasma Blaster, which can fire off a short burst of plasma, or can charge up his weapon to fire off a large energy orb that will detonate mid-flight. It also has a melee attack that does decent damage if the player gets too close and careless. Poses little threat to the player. The Soldier's Shield. This weaker demon is equipped with a shield in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Its shield can absorb quite a bit of damage, but is easily destroyed with a plasma rifle. The shotgun it wields hurts if the player gets too close. It is somewhat dangerous early on, but poses little threat as the player acquires new weapons. Spectre. This is the same with the Pinky, but however, with one catch, is that it is nearly invisible. If the player is not able to quickly identify this demon, it can wreak havoc on you in arena fights. It poses a great threat if not identified quickly enough. The Tyrant. This super heavy demon is the strongest of all non-bosses. It can take an extreme amount of damage before dying, as well as dish out a lot of damage. It can send out dangerous waves of hell energy with its right arm blade, as well as strike the player within melee range. Its left arm has a large retinue of projectile attacks, one of these which can lock onto the player and must be evaded. The only weakness this demon has is that it is rather slow and sluggish in its movement. It can properly be evaded with good movement if the player needs to focus on other demons first. Whiplash. This is a fairly tanky and very agile demon, as this demon can slither around quickly to flank the player and perform a painful flurry of melee attacks. As it can use its whips to send out fast-moving waves of hell energy, the damage output and the agility of this demon makes it very dangerous. It should be killed early on in fights, if possible, and is very dangerous at all times. Zombie. Basically a fodder demon that poses little to no threat to the player. It is best used to acquire resources such as health, armor, or ammo when needed. Buff totems. Buff totems is not an enemy itself, rather an object that when active will buff nearby demons. Demons affected by this buff have increased movement speed and damage output, and if killed while under the effect of this buff totem, it will be resurrected. This object can prove troublesome for new players or new playthroughs, but is not as much of an issue in repeated playthroughs as the player will already have foreknowledge of its location. However, this item should be destroyed as soon as possible. Moving on to bosses. Starting with the Gladiator. The Gladiator is the first true boss the player encounters later on in the story. This boss has two phases. In phase 1, he will mostly take cover behind his shield and will perform one of 3 attacks. In one attack, he will make a quick strike with his flail, but then immediately hide behind his shield, leaving little opportunity to counterattack. His second attack will also use his flail, however, it is more powerful, yet has a slower animation, and this will expose him as he spends time recovering. His third attack is unique in that he will take his flail and tap his shield, and then a red projection of that shield will quickly come forth towards the player. All of these attacks can be evaded with a properly timed dash. He will also summon in demons through the fight. This first phase is more about patience and waiting for the appropriate opportunity to counterattack. It is not too difficult, but a bit tedious. In phase 2, he will dual wield 2 flails instead of 1, and sport a few new array of attacks. He can, for example, spin his weapon rapidly to deflect incoming fire, and he will also perform 2 different flail attacks that are both similar to the previous phase, but instead of 1, he is using 2 flails. He will either do a quick double strike with both flails rapidly, or make a large leap towards the player, which is slower but more deadly. His last and most difficult ability to deal with is when he will fully extend both flails to box the player in. Then he will proceed to shoot out several waving beams of energy. These are tricky because you have to identify either to jump over the beam or to stand under it. If you make the mistake and place yourself in between the high and low beams, you will get hit regardless. So positioning is critical. At the end of this attack, he will make a quick dash towards the player that deals a lot of damage if it makes contact. Unlike the first phase, this is more frantic as the boss is more aggressive, yet is exposed and can be damaged most of the time. This boss fight, if anything, is a trial on learning when and how to dash appropriately. It may be a difficult fight, but with enough study and observation, you can evade most of his attacks. The Con Maker. The Con Maker is the second boss fight the player encounters, yet demands a different approach to defeat compared to the last one. Throughout the fight, the boss will cover the arena with more and more damaging ground effects, which will confine the player's movement throughout the arena. She is also assisted by Maker drones, but these enemies can be easily dealt with when using a weapon that can exploit enemy weak points, like the precision heavy cannon, sticky bomb shotgun, or ballista. The player will have a much easier time with this boss as the drones can drop much needed resources when killed by a headshot. She will let out a loud cry, then call forth a beam of fire like lightning of energy that will slowly track the player throughout the arena for a short duration. Her 2 main attacks are a large purple orb that can be evaded by simply strafing or taking cover. The other attack, she will shoot out these yellow waves of energy that can penetrate walls and demand a more precise timing when using the dash skill to not get hit. This fight seems difficult at first, but if the player can maintain aggression and keep damaging her, she will die fairly quickly. The only trick is to reaching her to perform Blood Punch to break her armor off bit by bit. The obvious and most simple way to do this is by using the meat hook of the super shotgun. This fight is mostly about the player being able to execute good movement while putting damage on the boss. It is easy to get distracted by the damaging ground effects or the Maker drones, but she can be burned down fairly quickly. The Icon of Sin. This is the final boss and probably the most enjoyable of the 3. This boss has 2 phases and requires that the player actually focus on parts of its body to destroy individually due to its immense size. In phase 1, the Icon of Sin can either perforate a portion of the arena with a damaging ground effect, conjure in more demons, or actually pummel the player with strikes from his left or right arms, as well as bashing the entire arena with its body. The boss can conjure a form of fiery projectiles from its forehead. One is a repeated volley of moderately sized projectiles, and the other is a much larger and dangerous explosive. The arena is littered with plenty of pickups for the Crucible, the Blood Punch, and the BFG, as well as health and armor. The only thing the player needs to do is properly focus on one body part at a time and stay on the move. Getting too focused on one body part without moving can get you pummeled by the boss or surrounded by other demons fairly quickly. Because of how plentiful ammo is for things such as the Blood Punch, the Crucible, and the BFG, it is better to simply just use the Crucible on the lesser demons and save all of your ammo for the main boss, as you will need all of it and then some to take him out. Phase 2 is more or less similar to the last phase, but the arena has a different layout. Besides his abilities from the first phase, there are 2 new attacks he will use. The first new one, he can call down a firestorm that will completely litter the arena, so the player needs to haul ass to not get overwhelmed. Also, he will use a super powerful, super wide beam of hell energy that projects from his forehead. He will first charge this attack up before firing, and the beam, when shot, will make a very unique and distinctive sound and then proceed to slowly track the player throughout the arena. So it is best to try and avoid this attack by simply taking cover. The rules in this phase are the same as before. You simply just have to stay on the move and save most of your ammo for shooting the boss, and simply just use the Crucible to deal with the lesser demons. There is plenty of room to move around unhindered, so use this to your advantage. The final boss is not hard, it just requires the player to execute some basic fundamentals. The Icon of Sin is easily the most enjoyable, as you simply have to keep shooting at it until it dies. Moving on to my conclusion of my analysis of Doom Eternal, where I will list some of my general praises and complaints and nitpicks I have about the game. Doom Eternal is able to take the fast and chaotic combat from Doom 2016 and somehow turn everything up from 11. When you include the addition of so many new features and tools for the Doomslayer's arsenal, the combat can become completely insane. Whereas most games, they would take the time kind of holding the player's hand, Doom Eternal somehow is able to grant the player this new arsenal at such a rapid pace, and yet get them into the flow of the combat as soon as possible. And, while this may be a bit overwhelming at first for newer players, on repeated playthroughs, this is a better choice because there's so little downtime from when the player actually starts to where things start to pick up combat-wise. So, it's clear that id Software wants you to get into the combat flow of things immediately. Also, Doom Eternal does a fantastic job at making the player feel sucked into the absolutely huge setting that they've managed to create. The scale and the scope have been supercharged this time around. The introduction of the Fortress of Doom is a neat feature, as it gives the player to kind of enjoy some downtime and, admire their collectibles in between, the intensity of the game. And the Repertorium is also great in that it allows the player to kind of experiment and practice with stuff in between missions. The improvements for the player in terms of how they can pursue their own progression in empowering the Doomslayer is also an excellent approach. For example, being able to pick up a rune, any one of the 9, as soon as you interact with your first one, is a great design choice. One thing that bothers me about other games, and it's kind of commonplace, but it's like you have all these great new features or tools in terms of your gameplay and combat, and some of those cool things are unfortunately only available when the player gets to a certain point in the progression. So sometimes they have little actual gameplay time to interact with those features. Whereas in Doom Eternal, the way that they have designed the progression, it kind of allows you to look at stuff that you may want to try out, and you're able to access it rather quickly instead of waiting until the very end of the story or some crap like that. So, giving the player more agency in how they progress in terms of their power level is always a smart design choice. Also, Doom Eternal tries to strive for a more cinematic approach due to, for example, like showing the Doomslayer in third person at times. This is never an issue, as in it never takes priority over the gameplay. Also, to consider in game development, sometimes you have ideas that are good on paper, but in reality are actually kind of tedious and annoying. And somehow Doom Eternal is able to avoid those kind of superfluous issues and systems and like obtuse design. And there's no artificial barrier, so to speak, that interferes with the player's ability to kind of play and enjoy the game. Doom Eternal also offers a lot of great options to customize the interface. And while something as simple as like custom button mapping, it sounds like small fries, you would be amazed at how many games do not allow the player that level of interface customization. And for that, id Software should really get a round of applause for that. Doom Eternal also has a strong feel of like old school PC game design. They have, instead of progressing, they have kind of regressed further into the old school mentality of how games were back in the day. Playing through Doom Eternal, it was like it reminded me of being a kid. Playing like some computer game in this big overwhelming setting with these awesome graphics, and just being completely lost like a clueless child, but just having an amazing time. Like I rarely ever feel that way about a game. That's how impressive Doom Eternal is. Also, when the player's arsenal is like fully decked out, and there are these countless demons that are storming towards you, and then those heavy metal tracks like kick in. I mean, the combat is just pure like gameplay euphoria. It's absolutely amazing. Enemy model damage is also highly detailed, even if it comes off as a bit cartoony. But I think that's the point. It's a cool and neat feature that adds a lot of flavor to the Doom aesthetic. But it also kind of serves a function in that it helps inform the player on how close an enemy is to dying. Continuing, Doom Eternal is highly polished and refined in that it does a great job at presenting information to the player. It's clear to me that id Software wants the player to quickly identify and come to grasp with how certain systems work. That way, the majority of the time that the player spends playing Doom Eternal is actually in the gameplay itself and not dealing with like some tedious bullshit, in between. That's also really impressive. Enemy AI is also impressive in that each demon has its own kind of unique function in terms of how it operates or how it interacts with the player. So, for example, like a Baron of Hell or a Dread Knight or a Hell Knight, they're designed to be very aggressive and constantly pursue the player and put pressure on you. Whereas something like the Prowler or the Imp or the Whiplash, like they will at times be very evasive, try to flank and get around or behind the player, and then sometimes they will make an aggressive attack. So they're very kind of random in their actions. And then of course you have enemies like the Carcass or the Archvile, where they primarily evade the player because they're trying to serve some other function, like in the case of the Archvile, trying to summon in more demons, which can make fights a lot more difficult. So all around, I mean, there's so many good things to talk about Doom Eternal, but it's quite astonishing what id Software was able to accomplish, going from Doom 2016 to Doom Eternal. So. Now for the complaints and nitpicks I have about the game. One of the big new changes of Doom Eternal that I have very mixed feelings about are on the spaces in between the fights. There was a no-clip video that I had saw where Hugo Martin was being interviewed, and I remember he had stated that Doom 2016 was criticized because there wasn't enough to do in between fights. And it's very clear that they took that criticism to heart, because they have so much shit that they're trying to put in between those arena spaces. And I feel like a lot of that stuff, it adds so little, if anything, to the actual overall fun factor of Doom Eternal. Like things like the purple goo, I find kind of dumb because it completely removes the player's ability to jump or dash. And one of the big things about Doom is movement, and to have something like that completely kind of neuters the player's movement is, I think that's just kind of backwards thinking. Also, like with the toxic environments and like using the rad suits, and then you have one or two swimming sections in the whole game, and then you have like the environmental hazards and the environmental traps. Like there's just so many things that they're in Doom Eternal, and they're spread out so rarely, and they're so sporadic in their appearance. It just feels like they were trying to just throw shit at the wall until they found something that stuck. And I mean the game is absolutely amazing in every other department, but I feel like they were trying too hard to try and figure out like what they could have the player do in between the fights. When Doom Eternal, or Doom games in general, that's what the focus is. The focus is the combat. The focus is the intense gameplay, right? That's the main focus. The only thing they could maybe do is perhaps, help add like more narrative cutscene exposition stuff in between fights, or perhaps they could implement a more unique like platforming system that kind of helps the player improve their movement skills. Something like that would actually serve a real function, because some of the platforming stuff, or a lot of it that you do in between fights, really serves no purpose in the combat. And I think if they implemented a system like that to where you were platforming, but in a way that it kind of educates you on improving your movement skills, so that applies to the combat, I think that would have been a smarter way to go about it. But anyways, moving on. In combat, certain enemy attacks can kind of, slap the player around. I don't have an issue with this feature necessarily, but there are some times where you can kind of get caught in like a ping pong combination where, Whiplash hits you and that throws you around, and then that bumps you into a fucking Hell Knight and he slaps you, and then that bumps you into a Mancubus, and then he does his area of effect ground pound. And you're just you're just fucking all over the place, and it can be rather irritating at times. And it's not that the player doesn't have the tools to kind of reposition or get out of that hairy situation. It's just it can be a little tedious and annoying at times. And while I don't have a problem with that feature, I hope that it can be perhaps reworked in a more kind of smooth or responsive way, perhaps. The weapon wheel also still feels a bit sluggish when trying to change weapons quickly. This is, of course, mainly an issue with console players, such as myself, but I just wish this was a bit more responsive and snappy. But unfortunately, it still feels a little sluggish like it does in Doom 2016. Now, one final complaint I have, and this is more about the narrative, is I don't mind that id Software is trying to expand the Doom universe, trying to add more story and settings, so on and so forth. But in order to do this, it would take some incredibly clever writing, if you think about it. Like the Doomslayer, he's a silent protagonist. So, how are you going to work around something like that if you're trying to put more story into the Doom games? That's just something to think about. One interesting point, who I've referenced before, a YouTuber by the name of Noah Jarvey, he had made another good observation, and this is about Doom Eternal, in that the game is kind of confusing to the player and the audience, in that there's this weird, Doom Eternal has a lot of fan service, and that itself is not an issue. It's that there are things in the game, like for example, his room with his computer screens where you have your weapons and your collectibles. It's set up in a way that it looks like the perfect Doom players, like the perfect Doom fan, and his hideout, right, or his den. And there's just this weird, it's hard to tell, okay, is the Doomslayer his own person, or is he also the perfect Doom fan of himself? It's kind of weird meta-narrative stuff, but it's nonetheless an acute observation that Noah Gervais had made. So that kind of wraps it up for my analysis of Doom Eternal. It was obviously very exhaustive because there was so much to talk about the game. But I will be moving on to the third and the last part, and finally wrap this thing up. So, how does Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal compare to one another? Where do they differ, and perhaps which game did something better compared to the other? Starting with the look and feel of things, going all the way back to the very first previews and footage of Doom 2016 that id Software had put out to the public, while the gameplay was clearly more akin to Doom 1 and 2, the look and feel of things was definitely closer to that of Doom 3, in that it had a more grounded, more believable aesthetic, almost like a horror-like game in its appearance. When you look at enemies like, for example, the Revenant, even though the silhouette is practically the exact same in both Doom games, in Doom 2016 it has a fairly unsettling, uncomfortable kind of look to its design, whereas with the change in color palette, the Revenant in Doom Eternal looks almost cartoonish in appearance, really. Things like the Hell Knight, as well, are practically a one-to-one recreation from Doom 3, as well as like weapon design. The rocket launcher looked very believable. It looked like a real weapon that functioned in Doom 2016. Whereas in Doom Eternal, it has these glowing skulls and these chains built into its infrastructure, and it just looks totally ridiculous. So it's very clear that with Doom Eternal, they went in the exact opposite direction, and they were going for the crazy, over-the-top, just utterly ridiculous design. And I think that helps kind of set it apart from the look and feel of other shooters on the market. Now, I kind of speculate that I think id Software, they went with the look and feel of Doom 3 for Doom 2016 because, that was the most recent Doom game in people's memories, so to speak. And, keep in mind that game came out in 2004, and Doom, 2016 came out in the year of 2016. So you're talking about more than a decade from the last time a Doom game was put out to the public. So perhaps they felt like that level of familiarity and that being the most recent, it made more sense to kind of go with that approach so it was easily recognizable. But I would say that both of the Doom games here, they have their own unique approach to things. So I can't really say like which one's better. It really just has to do with taste, I suppose. Going on to level design and navigation, when you look at arena fights, I can easily say that Doom Eternal has better flow to the combat with the design of the arenas. Like Doom 2016, of course, was trying to ease the player into the flow of the combat and didn't want to overwhelm them too early on. However, even in the later levels, by the time the player is familiar with how the game works, some of those spaces you fight in are pretty confined. Like there's a fight. It's right before I think you face the Hell Guardian boss, where you have like a Cyber Mancubus and like these two Barons of Hell, or vice versa, and you're kind of just in this fairly small kind of area that you have to face them before you go off to fight the boss, and so there's not a lot of room to move around there, unfortunately. And I think before that they put you in a hallway where they kind of lock the doors and you have to fight a few specters and like I think a Baron of Hell or two. So there's clearly not a lot of room to move around in some of those environments. So Doom Eternal definitely is more refined and polished in that the arenas are broader and there's a lot of verticality. So even in like the Slayer gates, which those arenas are not very large, there's a lot of verticality to them. And with the addition of like the monkey bars and the placement of like the jump tools or the jump pads you can use, the player is clearly able to maintain a better speed and movement while they're fighting. However, when it comes to the actual level design itself and the progression, people may forget, but when you look at levels like Argent Facility and the Foundry in the previous Doom, those levels were a bit more open-ended in that the player actually had an amount, or the player had their own agency in terms of how they explored and how they progressed through that level to complete it. Doom Eternal, while the levels are very large, in scope and size in comparison, the progression through those levels is fairly direct. And while I myself do not necessarily take issue with that change, I would hope that in future Doom games that they would kind of go to that more open-ended level design. For example, let's take Deus Ex, right? Things like Human Revolution in particular. You had two cities. You had the city of Detroit and the city of Hangsha. And while the real estate of those areas were not very big, there was so much detail and intricacy and just how the level was interconnected and how it flowed that you really felt like you were exploring a small piece of this very large city in the Deus Ex game. And that just simply in the player's mind that allows them to kind of be immersed and they feel like they're just exploring a little piece of the puzzle instead of just roughly kind of following a straight line, so to speak. So I don't really have an issue with how Doom Eternal turned out, but once again, I hope that in future Dooms, things can be a bit more open ended. Now, of course, one big difference, and it's kind of a gripe of mine, is the spaces between levels. It's very clear that they took that criticism to heart. That hey, there's not much to do in between fights. And it's just like they just kept, coming up with all, new and weird things to do in between the fights. And to me, it added so very little, if anything, to the actual overall fun factor and enjoyment of Doom Eternal. I understand, like, for example, things like the rad suits, that was something that did exist in the old Doom games. But, does that actually really add anything to Doom Eternal? Is it fun? Is it enjoyable? If it's not, it probably doesn't need to be in there. And there's so much fun with the game as it is. Like, was it really necessary to add those things? If you look at Doom 2016, it was simply just either, you may have like some story exposition, or, for example, in one level, when you get to meet Samuel Hayden for the first time, and he kind of talks to the player for a bit. Or when the player goes to find the Helix Stone, and you had those. What were they? They were holograms, right? You had these holograms of like Olivia Pierce talking to like her cultist followers, or talking to Samuel Hayden. Like that stuff was implemented perfectly because it didn't interfere with what the player was doing. If they were doing a speed run, or they're like, hey, I don't give a shit, you can fly right by that, right? There's nothing stopping you. And it was just kind of naturally kind of built into the environment. And I felt like that added more to the game than what they were doing with Eternal. I feel like the spaces in between fights should be a time where the player can catch their breath and kind of, recollect their thoughts, so to speak. Because Doom Eternal, it's a very intense game, and there's a lot going on in the combat. And if you're constantly trying to keep them on their toes with all these ridiculous kind of platforming sections, or hey, here's the section where you have to swim in this toxic goo, which that feature shows up once or twice in the whole game. I just hope that in the future games that they just simply keep the spaces in between fights as something to either give the player exposition, or like codex entries, maybe some environmental storytelling, or perhaps design it in a way that it helps the player maybe improve their movement overall. So when they start to go deeper into the game, that they get better at these fights because they're starting to execute better movement because of how things are designed in between those fights. So hopefully, in the next Doom game that gets improved. But I wasn't really too impressed with how they did things in Doom Eternal, unfortunately. So in that case, I'll have to give it to Doom 2016. Moving on to sound and music. Now, of course, with the soundtrack, Mick Gordon did, if not all of it, almost all of it, from what I understand. Whereas Doom 2016 is more or less about paying homage to the legacy of Doom. You know, you look at Harbinger, which is clearly an inspired track of the menu theme for Doom 3. You look at Hellwalker, which is clearly a reimagining of the Sign of Evil track from the classic Dooms. There's a clear effort to, you know, pay homage to the legacy of Doom, whereas Doom Eternal is more or less just kind of going in a new direction, but also applying, you know, the kind of nature that the soundtracks were in Doom 1 and 2. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think it was a man by the name of Robert Prince, I think, but he essentially would take these tracks from like Pantera, Alice in Chains, Slayer, you know, some other popular metal bands at the time, and he would, you know, take bits and pieces of those and just kind of put it into a converter, and you had your 16 or 32-bit, whatever it was, you know, heavy metal soundtrack, and that was kind of it. And, you know, with Doom Eternal kind of moving in more of the heavy metal, or putting more emphasis on those types of tracks, which I'm all for, you know, it doesn't bother me at all. I'm a heavy metal guy myself, but both of them overall are pretty good. I like them both, and I think soundtracks for both games are pretty decent overall. Looking at the overall kind of sound design, areas like the surface of Mars or the parts of the UAC facility were done fairly well and somewhat immersive. I feel like the levels that took place in the Hell Dimension in Doom 2016 were kind of empty. However, with the next Doom, like, because of the size and the scope, the environments I feel like have a lot more. You know, it's littered with a bunch of details in terms of kind of bringing the player, you know, into the world, into the setting. Even things like the enemies and the weapons, like the enemy sound is more polished and refined in that everything feels like it has a very distinct sound effect. So, for example, like if the Prowler is teleporting around and he's trying to flank you, you can clearly hear that unique sound and identify where he's at or where he's coming from, so to speak. Like weapons, things like the heavy assault rifle and the plasma rifle were really underwhelming in their sound. They just felt very weak in Doom 2016, whereas with Doom Eternal, everything feels very meaty. Feels like it packs a big punch, a big wallop behind every shot fired. So I would say in terms of overall sound design, Doom Eternal is much more refined and polished. Moving on to story and narrative. Now, there's really not much in Doom 2016 in terms of the plot. It's fairly simple and straightforward. I feel like with that game, it's more about the meta-narrative. It's more about the legacy of Doom, the legacy of the Slayer himself, that, you know, he is the first like silent protagonist. He is the first kind of hero, you know, with guns blazing in the FPS genre. And I think that the narrative focuses more on that instead of an actual plot. With Doom Eternal, of course, they've put a lot more effort in building up the setting, adding to the lore, you know, with the codex entries. There's so much detail about the Sentinels and the Makers. It talks a little bit about like the UAC and Ark and what's going on in Earth. And while the narrative, like for example, everything took place in first person in the previous Doom game, whereas with Doom Eternal, of course, you know, you have, you know, these kind of third person cinematics where you actually get to see the Doom player like interact with the world around him. And you know, compared to how big the game is, you know, there's really not that much story there, relatively speaking. It's more or less kind of building up, preparing the universe, so to speak. And I don't have an issue with it, but I am a little curious, as in, like, if they're really going to dedicate themselves to try and build a story and a narrative with the upcoming Doom games, like, it's going to take some clever writing, you know, because the Slayer, he is a silent protagonist, and so far, like, you haven't had any other really interesting characters, you know, to either oppose the Slayer or be part of a supporting cast. So it's kind of weird. I don't know how things are going to turn out with where they're taking things, but you know, we'll see what happens in the future. Okay, moving onwards to gameplay, beginning with movement. Now, fundamentally, movement is the same in both Doom games. However, with Doom Eternal, you have two new interesting features. One of them being the monkey bars, and the other being the dash ability. And these two things actually add a lot more variety than you may think. For example, with the dash ability, you can use it to close the distance on an enemy, perhaps to perform like a glory kill, for example. You can also use it to kind of get yourself out of a hairy situation if need be. And also, you can actually use dashing while you're airborne, which adds a lot to kind of aerial combat in general, and maintaining your hang time, so to speak. Monkey bars also add to this as well. What's interesting is that with monkey bars, every time you use one, your secondary jump will be reset. So you can use one and jump once more every time you use one. So in certain arenas, if they're close enough, you can actually keep yourself in the air, for quite a while. Or you could use a launch pad somewhere and then hit a monkey bar and then go back and forth and back and forth. Especially when you're using the air control rune, it really adds a lot in that you can keep yourself sustained in the air for longer. Which, being able to use all three dimensions and movement, especially on harder difficulties, will keep you alive for a lot longer. So I just think that just kind of improves the combat flow of things, and they're really cool features, I think. Moving on to weapons, starting with kind of the melee system. Glory kills operate the same fundamentally. The only difference is that on harder difficulties in Doom Eternal, demons will really do their best to kind of get on top of the player and surround you. So even though you're invulnerable during the animation, sometimes it's not worth doing a glory kill because you'll be so surrounded by the time you get out of the animation that any health you picked up, you'll immediately lose it. So glory kills are a bit more of a tactical choice in that you have to kind of observe your surroundings where you perform one. The standard melee attack is kind of completely useless now. Like used to, you could take out fodder demons with it and maybe like imps or something. But in Doom Eternal, it seems like it does no damage almost. However, they did add a new feature called the Blood Punch, which it can destroy armor on certain units, or in the case of the Pinky, it can just kill them outright. Also, it's really helpful for just basically creating some breathing room if you get surrounded. Due to the shockwave it puts out. So it is a cool new feature. It actually adds some real function to your melee attack. Going to the chainsaw, the chainsaw, it served the same function in the previous Doom game. However, with Doom Eternal, it is now an essential part of the loop in that before you would have so much ammo you could stockpile by upgrading later on in the game. You could really just kind of kite around the outside of the arena and then kill everything and then move on. And of course, there were a lot more pickups in the arenas in the previous game. Whereas with this one, the chainsaw is an essential part of the gameplay loop in that you can only kill so many enemies and then you're going to have to find a demon to chainsaw to kind of resupply. And this is kind of forcing the player to kind of get into the thick of things and put yourself in a lot of danger to resupply. So it's an interesting twist on the gameplay loop. Of course, you have the introduction of the Crucible, which it appears, very late in the game, but it serves a function in that, whereas something like the BFG is good at killing, most of the demons, the super heavies will either resist or not die when hit by the BFG. So the Crucible, I feel like, is really designed to just really take out the super heavy demons that you encounter, in my opinion. Looking at something like the combat shotgun, the charge burst in 2016 was kind of underwhelming. Most people went with the grenade launcher modifier. I actually preferred how it was in the previous Doom in that when you got a direct, of course when it was fully upgraded, when you got a direct hit, it would spawn these multiple fragments of smaller explosions. So getting a direct hit with that was actually very powerful, relatively speaking. Whereas with Doom Eternal, the full auto mode replaces the charge burst, which I think is better, but it does chew through ammo pretty quickly. However, it does do some good sustained damage. The sticky bomb mode and the other one, it's different in that it doesn't explode on combat. It's a hence the word sticky bomb. But also overall, it doesn't really do much damage. I think they really designed that really just to exploit enemy weak points, and that's kind of its purpose. It's not really designed to just lob all those grenades at someone and kill them. So I would say overall, the combat shotgun is improved in Doom Eternal in terms of its function, but I do prefer the how it was in Doom 2016. Moving on to like the heavy assault rifle. Everything about it in Eternal, I feel like, is just much improved in my opinion. The look of the weapon, the feel of the weapon, the sound effects is much better. You had essentially the same mods in the previous Doom game, but really mostly everyone would go with the micro missiles because it was just easier to use, and the precision scope really didn't. It did more damage, if you got a headshot, but it wasn't really as effective as its Doom Eternal counterpart. Now with Doom Eternal, the micro missiles are still decent, and then you have the ability where if you kill an enemy with the standard firing mode, it'll increase the damage output of the missiles, which is pretty cool. However, the precision scope this time around is much stronger. It'll actually consume like 6 points of ammunition per round, and it actually has kind of like a cooldown between shots. But it actually does quite a bit of damage. So overall, the assault rifle is definitely improved in Doom Eternal. Plasma rifle, kind of the same thing. I felt like it was the weakest weapon in Doom 2016. The heat blast, or the heat blast modifier, it was okay, but not really that impressive. The stun bomb was easily the most useful part of that weapon in that game, but like the standard firing mode just kind of sucked. In Doom Eternal, it feels like it packs a greater punch, and it has some utility in terms of like destroying enemy shields, so on and so forth. The microwave beam, I'm still kind of not impressed with because it spends way too much ammo for the amount of damage it does on an enemy, even when it's fully upgraded. Even the concussive blast it sets off when you kill enemies, while it looks fantastic in terms of function, it's kind of weak. And then the movement speed penalty is so strong, it's just, to me, it's not worth using. However, the heat blast, or the heat wave, whatever it's called, is definitely stronger this time around. So overall, I feel like the plasma rifle was improved. Rocket launcher. Now, this weapon was, both firing modes actually had a pretty good function in the previous game, and they basically just, actually made it better in Doom Eternal. For example, the remote detonation, while it functions a little differently, it's just as effective, if not more so, with Doom Eternal. Now, the lock-on burst is actually even better in that, it would actually take you a little bit of time to lock onto a target, where here it pretty much locks on super quick when it's upgraded, and then you can actually lock onto 2 separate targets to send off 2 volleys at once, which is really powerful. So overall, the weapon is even somehow stronger than what it was before. Moving on to the Gauss Cannon and Ballista, it's kind of a mixed bag for me because, for example, like the Arbalist mode on the Ballista, I feel like is better than the precision mode of what was on the Gauss Cannon in the previous Doom. However, I really liked Siege mode in the previous Doom, and the way that they have it in Doom Eternal, it's kind of underwhelming in my opinion. Like, it's a crescent wave instead of having like a big beam that can kind of penetrate multiple targets. And it's not that it's useless. It's simply that it takes so long to charge, and your movement speed is nerfed so much that on harder difficulties you're almost never going to use that, unless you like combine it with a good timed freeze grenade. The Gauss Cannon, while in Siege mode, your movement speed was basically halted to a standstill, and then if you had it fully upgraded, you could move very slowly. But relatively speaking, it would charge fast enough to where, if you had the right opportunity, you could find a spot, fully charge up the siege mode, hit an enemy, and then reposition. Whereas the Destroyer Blade, I just feel like it takes too much time and it's not worth the damage output. Looking at the chain gun, which I felt like was the worst offender in Doom 2016 in terms of the firing modes. In the previous Doom, you had the rotator and then you had the mobile turret. And fully upgraded, they basically kind of did the same thing. Like, the other one, the Gatling rotator did decent damage, but the player maintained full movement speed. Whereas the mobile turret mode, the player moved a little slower, and then it did a little more damage and had better suppression. But they were kind of the same. In Doom Eternal, though, it's totally improved. Like, the mobile turret actually does some pretty damn good damage this time around, and you don't have to worry about the movement speed penalty once it's upgraded. And then the shield, of course, is obviously a more defensive choice. And depending on certain fights, or especially if you want to play on a harder difficulty, the energy shield for the chain gun is definitely useful. So I feel like this gun overall has seen the best improvements compared to the previous game. The super shotgun, now in Doom 2016, this gun was honestly kind of overpowered. When fully upgraded, the reload speed and the damage output was so strong that most players would just use it 90% of the time compared to other weapons. In Doom Eternal, it is a bit more balanced in that while it is a strong weapon, you have to make sure your shots count because it uses 2 shells and you go through ammo pretty fast. However, they have compensated it by adding the meat hook, which adds all kinds of things that the player can do with it. You can use it, once fully upgraded, of course, it can provide you armor when it sets people on fire. It is able to allow you to close the distance with an enemy. Either you can do a glory kill or just hit them with the shotgun or chainsaw them for ammo. And then, of course, you can just use it as a tool to move around the map. So overall, like the change to the super shotgun, I think is great. BFG 9000 seems like it functions the same, relatively speaking. It feels a little weaker because, like, the super heavy demons are just, they take a lot of damage. But overall, it kind of feels and functions the same way. The only difference is that in Doom 2016, you could carry 3 charges, whereas with Doom Eternal, it seems like you can only carry 2. But that's the really only major difference. The Unmaker, I really wasn't too impressed with when I unlocked it. I mean, in terms of look and feel, it seems really cool, but the way it functions, it's just better to use the BFG, honestly. Looking at the equipment stuff and like the grenades, in Doom 2016, you had the siphon grenade, the frag grenade, and the hologram. The hologram was pretty useful in terms of repositioning or get out of a hairy spot, and then the siphon grenade with the equipment power rune was kind of overpowered, honestly. Like, it got to a point to where when it was fully upgraded, you could actually drain armor off enemies. So it was really strong in terms of kind of keeping the player alive. Looking at Doom Eternal, they've actually managed to kind of take the equipment system that really wasn't used much outside of the siphon grenade, and kind of bring it to the forefront where it's kind of an intricate part of the they brought it to the forefront of the gameplay loop, so to speak. So like the flame belt, you pretty much always use it because you want to get armor and stay alive, right? Self-explanatory. The frag grenade is actually key in kind of staggering demons or killing clusters of weaker demons. And then the freeze grenade, of course, is kind of self-explanatory. It can buy you some breathing room, allow you to put up a precision shot, or helping you in burning down like the super heavy demons. So overall equipment has been improved, and they've really kind of brought it to the forefront. One more thing I'll mention is that with masteries, in the previous Doom, masteries were really mixed in that some of them were super easy to do and others were like a real pain in the ass. Whereas in Doom Eternal, it takes some time and dedication, but relatively speaking, they take an equal amount of effort to accomplish. So, moving on to the Praetor suit upgrades, runes, and power-ups. Starting with the Praetor suit. Now, this is still kind of a mixed bag for me in both games because there are certain upgrades to the Praetor suit that serve little to no purpose. The worst offender probably being the upgrades that have to do with map navigation and exploring secrets. Now, while those upgrades are improved, generally speaking, in Doom Eternal, ultimately I don't really think it's that useful. Like, for example, let's say you have someone who's trying to explore everything and get all the secrets and collectibles, right? Or they're trying to get the achievement or trophy for that. What do they end up doing? In reality, they go to the internet, they go to YouTube, they go to a website, and they look up a guide that shows them kind of where everything's at. They're not going to spend all day trying to find that stuff on their own. And while I feel like Doom Eternal does a good job at informing the player of the presence of those secrets, and so the player just has to find out how to access it, whereas in Doom 2016, stuff was really kind of hidden and you kind of had to go out of your way to find them. I just feel like that category of suit upgrades is just redundant. Even if you were to take what I just said out of the picture, it's only really going to be useful in your first playthrough. Once you do, a second or third playthrough, if you do, you're already going to know where pretty much most, if not where all that stuff is at. So in the long run, I don't think it serves much purpose. Also, the upgrades in terms of like the environmental stuff, like, in reduced environmental damage, that stuff is kind of, it's probably best for newer players or inexperienced players, but those kind of upgrades are really not needed. The only ones that serve any real function are like the ones that reduce the cooldown on your equipment upgrades, or in the case of like the previous Doom, you had one category that was dedicated to power-ups. So one of them being that it would increase the duration of it, which was really strong. So it's kind of a mixed bag, honestly, in terms of, you have one half that's actually really useful, one part that's kind of redundant, and the other one that's kind of going on to runes, I feel like Doom Eternal does a fantastic job with the rune system. I say that because in the previous Doom, certain runes could only be unlocked once you got so far in the story. So you got to spend less time using that rune or experimenting with it. And then, of course, each rune could be upgraded. And while I like the idea of taking a rune and improving it, some of those would take a very long time, to where the player would basically just have to find a spot in the game and just keep reloading the checkpoint to upgrade some of those runes. In Doom Eternal, it's just you pick a rune and there's no upgrading to it. And also, even the first one you come into contact with, you're able to pick any one of the 9 available, which I think is actually really cool. Also, they seem to get rid of like the more pointless ones. Like there was one, I think it was called Intimacy is Best, where it would make the demons less resistant to damage when they were staggered, to give you, an easier chance to perform a glory kill, and stuff like that. I felt like was just kind of pointless. But overall, the rune system is vastly improved, I think, and being able to pick any of them from the very start is really cool. Also, you're able to pick any equip 3 as soon as possible, whereas in the other Doom, you had to unlock more to be able to equip 3 or more at a time. Moving on to power-ups. With Doom Eternal, even though the game is longer than the previous Doom, power-ups seem to be a lot more scarce. Even if you were to kind of do a ratio of how many power-ups exist compared to how many arenas in both games, they still seem to be scarcer in compared to the previous Doom. Which I do find kind of interesting. Now, one thing that's really interesting to note is they have changed some of the functions. So, like, for example, haste is now called overdrive, and you're actually given unlimited ammo when you use it, because you would completely burn through ammo when you used haste in the previous Doom, and also you can only carry so much ammo this time around. So it makes a lot of sense as a function in terms of the infinite ammo boost. Now, what's interesting is that, unlike the previous Doom, the more enemies you kill while under the effect of the power-up will increase its duration even more so, which I think is kind of cool, because that actually encourages the player to be even more aggressive. So while power-ups are a lot more scarce, their function, I think, is improved, which is really cool. Moving on to Sentinel crystals. Now, in the previous Doom, you had these Argent orbs that you would pick up and absorb, and you could increase, armor, health, or ammo, which is the same in Doom Eternal. However, they have these other upgrades that are kind of layered in, which is kind of neat. So I would say functionally it's still the same, but you have this kind of interesting dynamic choice where certain upgrades, you have to buy two of them, but then certain, like, whether it's health or ammo or armor are kind of linked to them. So it's an interesting way of kind of like layering the progression there of the Doomslayer, so to speak. And then the introduction of extra lives. I'm kind of indifferent on this. Like I look at it as people who are not accustomed to the Doom formula, or just the kind of pacing of the combat and how things work. I think that was mainly introduced just for the newer demographic, either for people who just want to breeze through the game, or people that are having a hard time adjusting to kind of how Doom functions. If there's anything that Doom Eternal does, is that it kind of bends over backwards to compensate newer and inexperienced players. I mean, the fact that you can actually use cheats to go through levels and that won't hinder your progression, with the exception being Slayer Gates, is actually kind of cool. So I just look at it as a way to kind of help out newer players. But me, I don't really care for extra lives myself. Moving on to enemies. Now, not only are there a lot more enemies in Doom Eternal, but the AI actually seems to be improved, and they all kind of serve their own unique function in terms of how they engage the player. So, in the previous Doom, for the most part, enemies would really just kind of run towards the player or just attack them. One exception, like the Imp or the Summoner, they had somewhat of an evasive or an elusive AI. So, like, for example, the Summoner would often kind of teleport around to evade the player, to either summon in more demons or to kind of throw ranged attacks. The Imp kind of had a level of randomness, like they would either, try to melee the player, or they would climb up like ceilings or columns and throw ranged attacks. So they had a nice level of randomness, but most enemies would just attack the player or come straight for them. However, in Doom Eternal, there is actually a lot of variety in terms of how the AI functions. Some AI, like the Mancubus, will basically hang back and try and bombard the player with their ranged attacks. Enemies like the Whiplash and the Prowler, even the Gargoyle, they do a good job at kind of eluding the player and their attacks. Even the Arachnotron, come to think of it. However, they will occasionally become aggressive and pursue the player to attack them in some manner. Then, of course, you have like your Hell Knights, your Dread Knights, your Barons of Hell that are designed specifically just to pressure the player and always be on them. And then like the Archvile, even though that's a super heavy demon, he prefers to kind of be distant from the player and to either throw out ranged attack or summon in more demons. So not only do you have a larger variety of demons that serve their own function and how they engage the player, but the AI is varied enough to where they all kind of have their role to play. Like the Carcass, I think, is a great example of a demon in itself that is not necessarily threatening, but they do a great job at annoying the player with the shields they put up. So the combat is it's just more dynamic, and with the retinue of enemies you face, there's just a lot more going on. So the player really has to think how they go about the arena, how they engage the demons, and in which order that they want to prioritize in terms of killing them. Moving on to bosses. Bosses are, in Doom 2016, they were more straightforward. It was basically shoot them until they die and evade their attacks. Whereas Doom Eternal, they actually try to add like some mechanics to the fight. I'm a bit indifferent. I mean, the way bosses were in the first Doom, it was simple, but that's kind of how Doom games are, right? Just shoot it until it dies. But with Doom Eternal, they're they're trying to engage the player in interesting ways. So with the Gladiator, it's more or less about learning to time your dashes to evade his attacks, and then you know make a properly timed counterattack. The Marauder is another good example of this. The Con Maker is about player movement, avoiding the damaging ground effects while trying to put damage on the boss. And then the Icon of Sin is the classic Doom boss, where it's you just keep shooting the guy until he dies. Of course, there's a little more going on there, but I will say I like that they do try to change things up and engage the player in new and different ways with the bosses as well as the enemies. So I would say Doom Eternal overall is definitely an improvement from the previous game. One final subject I almost forgot to cover in my comparison of the two Doom games is actually the interface. Now, looking at the interface of Doom 2016, it's fairly sleek, simple, and non-invasive, and while there were some customization options, it was fairly limited. However, the interface did do a serviceable job at properly informing the player on what they need to know. And when you look at how close that game was in terms of presentation, look, and feel to Doom 3, it makes more sense that they would make the interface more utilitarian and simplified to match the overall presentation. Now, with Doom Eternal, however, the interface has completely changed and has been completely overhauled. For example, Doom Eternal offers a plethora of options in terms of customization of the interface for the player. Also, the manner in which the interface informs the player has been changed quite a bit. I remember Hugo Martin making a comment in one of the gameplay demonstrations of Doom Eternal before its release, in that he used the analogy of, imagine if you were on a racetrack and you were driving like a Ferrari or something, and you're hauling ass. You want to be able to quickly identify what's going on in and around you, and when you look at how chaotic and frantic Doom Eternal is, I tend to agree with that assessment. Even though at the time, I actually wasn't fond of how the interface was looking because it seemed a bit too noisy, but now that I've actually played the game, I actually agree with that assessment completely. Looking at the color coding, you're able to quickly identify, like, if it's shotgun, plasma or bullet ammo, as well as the equipment like the flamethrower and your grenades, and then of course you have your blood punch and dash. So the interface does a great job at quickly informing the player, as well as looking at the map design when you're navigating the maps. Like every object is clearly identified, whether it's a collectible, whether it's a fight or a secret encounter, so on and so forth. So they've really overhauled how that information is presented to the player. Also, the customization options I feel like are fantastic. Not only do they provide accommodations for colorblind people with their colorblind setup, but also something as simple as custom button mapping. You would think that would be more available in most games, but for some dumb reason it's not. Especially, with console gaming, it seems to be such a big issue for some reason. And the fact that something that simple they allowed in Doom Eternal is simply amazing. It's so simple, and it's not that hard to do, but the fact that, they went a little further and added all those options to customize the interface, I think they really deserve some praise for that. Now, how does Doom set itself apart from other FPS games, and why it is unique? The Doom series is unique due to many contributing factors. The most obvious is its setting and presentation. In Doom, the player must wage war against the oldest and greatest of all foes, Hell itself. Unlike games of modernity where villains are sympathetic and express multiple shades of gray in their moral compass, Doom's concept of morality is black and white. Some may find this too simple or perhaps boring. However, the player never needs to question themselves or their actions, neither show mercy or compassion towards their foes. The player is able to fully indulge themselves in violence and let loose their rage, for there is no reason to hold back, for your savagery is justified. The gameplay of Doom is equally unique and important. The player must contend with a perpetual onslaught of enemies, yet is granted a vast arsenal to stem the tide of darkness. There is no artificial restriction on what weapons can be carried or where they can be used, no bullshit about tactical choice or strategic planning. It's about reaction and effective use of weaponry, knowing what weapon is most effective on what enemy at the right moment. Understanding map navigation and your immediate surroundings, the placement of resources, and when to exploit the use of power-ups. Having good accuracy is important, but execution of good movement is equally significant. Learning to move in a manner to evade enemy attacks, while at the same time landing shots on those enemies, is demanding yet rewarding. Doom Eternal in particular gives so many tools to use that keeping track of all your equipment adds another layer to the gameplay mechanics. What sets apart Doom even more so is that it has an emphasis on aggression over defensive posturing. Games of modernity put value in stationary, stagnant firefights. Combat where the player is rewarded for turtling and taking pot shots while their health regenerates. Doom is the exact opposite. Being relentless and pushing forward is the only path to victory. Cowering and defensive posturing will always lead to defeat. If the player is low on ammo or near death, they must apply more aggression. Only from the slaying of your foes can your needs be satiated. Doom is able to engage the player on so many levels at the same time, and this is what sets it apart from shooters of the modern day. Every enemy has their own unique abilities and threats that they pose to the player. The player has an enormous arsenal of weaponry and equipment, each weapon having different firing modes and each piece of equipment having its own function. The arenas are vast and expansive, learning how to use the environment around you and executing good movement in those arenas. The large retinue of Praetor suit upgrades and runes that can affect how the player engages in the combat, all of this the player must contend with on top of the game moving at a breakneck speed. Adding to the chaos are the heavy metal soundtracks, which are not for some cinematic presentation or deep narrative developments. Instead, these soundtracks push the player further into the warrior's madness, to encourage them to be more aggressive, to go faster and harder than before. The music is there to help reflect the chaos and destruction of the gameplay. It wants you to indulge, and you shall. Doom is not about rewarding the player with accolades, trophies, or patting them on the back for every feat they accomplish. Doom is about the glory of the kill, the glory of wreaking havoc on your foes, completely demolishing your enemies and laying siege to the gates of hell and razing its cities to the ground. This is what makes a Doom game what it is. This is what sets it apart. The jump from Doom 2016 to Doom Eternal is like going from Devil May Cry 1 to Devil May Cry 3, or Metal Gear Solid 1 to Metal Gear Solid 2. The huge strides that id Software has made in improving the Doom formula is nothing short of astonishing. Doom 2016 helped reestablish Doom as a shooter, as a series, and paved the way, but Doom Eternal is the first game to really move the franchise forward. I've seen some complaints about Doom Eternal that it's too difficult or it demands too much from the player, having to use so many buttons to interact with so many different tools and features. Even looking at the most popular YouTube channels, seeing grown men wailing to the top of their lungs about how difficult the Marauder is and how it's an unfair enemy to face, when in reality, FPS games and the shooter genre as a whole have become too damn soft. So many shooters ask so little of the player and offer so little real challenge. There are so many similarities between FPS games of today's world that the transition takes so little to no effort going from one game to the other. Doom is the one shooter that takes all that conventional wisdom and tosses it in the blast furnace. I know I should stop myself before I go on a real tear, but it just bothers me when a game with completely fantastic balancing and gameplay mechanics gets overshadowed by a small collection of whiny bitches on YouTube. Anyhow, moving on. So, moving on to the biggest and most important question of the entire video. Why does the resurrection of the Doom franchise matter? What could Doom's success and popularity mean for the shooter genre, and how it can impact the gaming industry? The resurrection of the Doom series is important not for its own sake, but for the sake of shooters abroad. Doom harkens back to a time where games were made with the intention of creating a fictional reality that could never happen. A time when games were about pursuing the impossible and ridiculous. A time where the focus of game development was to create an experience that was unique, but equally fun and entertaining for the player. I can remember back during the time when I was a young kid in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there were so many games on the market that were fun and had their own unique features and gameplay mechanics. In today's world, games have become so big and so much money is being funneled into their development that they inevitably have to strive for the most common denominator to make their money back. I would go as far to say that Battle Royale games have become so big recently because so many games play the same that when a cool new interesting feature actually gets made, everyone wants to capitalize on that success instead of bringing their own unique ideas to the market. Another good example would be the unexpected mega success that was World of Warcraft, and how every MMO after its creation simply tried to copy Warcraft instead of coming up with their own new ideas to push the MMO genre forward. This hive mind mentality only serves to stagnate games and halt the progression of new ideas. I hope that the success of Doom will allow game developers to take a look and think to themselves, hey, id Software went out and made an FPS game that went against the grain and all the mainstream standards and totally knocked it out of the park. This could perhaps encourage developers abroad to pursue new and interesting ideas to push the shooter genre forward. And when I say this, I don't mean that every game should be like Doom. What I am saying is that we could see a change in the mindset of how video games are developed. That we could see games strive for new and unique features and gameplay mechanics that sets them apart from what is out there in the market. In this capacity, this is where I feel like Doom could have a real positive impact on the gaming industry at large. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions. Free-to-play games and the fundraising Kickstarter program clearly have helped pave the way, for new and bold ideas in game development. But if the success of Doom can help contribute to this, the more the better. So that wraps up most of what I had to say, which was a hell of a lot. This video was basically a labor of love. Whether 100 or 1 million people watch it, I still did this as my own passion project. As stated at the beginning of the video, I hope that I can give some new insight into Doom and the shooter genre and hopefully spark some conversation. Just to give a little history about myself, I actually live in Mesquite, Texas, where id Software made Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein. Here's a picture of the Town East Tower, and this is the building where they worked in, and I'm about a 5-minute drive from here. Now, id Software did end up moving further up north near Richardson and Plano years later, which is about a 20 to 30 minute drive from where I'm at. Here's the building that they work in now. My friend of 12 years and I actually went up to visit the id Software office and got to walk inside and take some photographs. Here are the photos that were taken. The black gentleman you see is my friend and the man who took most of the photographs you see before you. He is an equally passionate gamer like myself. He also has a YouTube channel he is trying to build and mainly talks about Sony and PlayStation related news. I will leave a link to his channel in the video description below. If any one of you out there who watch this are still on the fence about playing Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal, I will leave some recommended reviews down in the video description of 2 different YouTubers that I have a great deal of respect for and their quality game reviews. For those of you who watch this video, I hope I was able to provide some service to you for your time. Go out there, play some Doom, tell your friends about it, and don't forget, rip and tear until it is done.